Comes the money.
Here we go. Money talk.
Here comes the money. Money, 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 money.
Dollar, dollar. Dollar, dollar. Ching, ching, bling, bling. Cut the chatter. You ain't talking money, then you're talking no matter. Bonus track, bonus track.
That will cost you extra. See you later, sucker.
You know, the guy in the booth who's talking to you on a tiny little earphone, he's afraid the guys at network are going to tell him it's through if he lets the guy keep talking like I'm talking to you. Because the corporation's got the networks and they get to say who gets to talk about the country and who's crazy today. I would cut to a commercial if you still want this job, because you may not be back tomorrow with this corporate mob. Cut to a commercial.
Okay, flush him.
Cut the commercial. Cut the commercial. Cut the commercial. Cut the commercial. Okay.
Hello and welcome to Overlapping Dialogue, a podcast of audio commentaries dedicated to discussing cinema that fascinates us in a way we hope fascinates you. We're your co-hosts, Kyle and Levi Huffman. I'm Kyle.
And I'm Levi, and I'm right here.
We've been saying this for a while.
Yeah.
This is from some song, and if you happen to know what song that is from, and this is no contest, by the way. Well, you know what? We'll give you a little something if you can answer our question. But email us at HuffmanBrothersProductions@gmail.com. Again, that is HuffmanBrothersProductions@gmail.com. No underscores, no slashes.
We haven't turned into a 2000s oh, you remember this music podcast, by the way? Yeah, because I know we did that with Limp Bizkit recently. We're like, y'all remember that? And people were like, yeah, and we're like, well, we don't even like it, but, you know.
Something we're thinking about.
Yeah. Right here. I'm not sure.
We just do that all the time. The right here. It's probably like, we'll find out what it originally was, and it's probably like, right here. It's just all right, you know.
All right. Is that other song? Yeah.
The 90s.
Not the alt-rock.
Magical time. Gave birth to us.
Not alt-rock either. Yeah.
Speaking of the 90s, we're taking a trip down memory lane. We're going to the old...
By the way, can I tell a quick story?
Coffin in the sky kind of deal. What?
So,
that makes no sense.
All right, I'm going to go through this as quick as I can. Went to a Beta Club convention in North Carolina, where we're from, a couple years ago.
I've been there.
And in Greensboro. Anyway, there was this guy, and I don't remember his name, so I don't feel bad about talking kind of bad about it. I mean, he seemed like a nice enough guy, but...
Was he from your school?
No, he was basically elected by everybody at... We have these elections every year there of who's the president of the Beta Club for the state or whatever. This guy had been the president, I think, for 1 or 2 years. Well, it's like I think he wasn't anymore, but he still held some kind of position there. And he was like our age.
He was president emeritus, if you will.
But anyway, and he got up and gave this whole... It's like, you know, people that go to these things, it's like there's... Let's just be honest about this stuff. People that go to these things that are like me, who are like, yeah, I like being in Beta Club, and yeah, I'll go and do it. We mainly went because you had competitions and stuff.
And you did some of the writing competitions, yeah. Did they do quiz bowl competitions there,
They
too?
did. I wasn't in the quiz bowl at that point, but I did some scoring for it. I helped run the scoreboard for that. But anyway, and the guy, first of all, whenever those people would come out, they would play the Pirates of the Caribbean theme. They walked out, the presidents and the vice president and secretary and treasurer and all them people would come out, and we were always just like, wow. You can tell somebody thought that was so cool 15 years ago, and then they've just kept it, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, by the way, there was a guy there that was one of the sound guys that looked exactly like Mark Carman. So, by the way, exactly like him. So, was it him? I don't know. Anyway. So, this guy that was the president or whatever of it, he was about our age. But, you know, there's these type of people that, frankly, they're just, going to be business people in the future. They're very,
political science people, maybe,
and they're, very, fake and everything they do and say. Anyway, and he got up there, and he was like, his whole theme for his, his keynote address or whatever was let's take a trip down memory lane. I remember him saying, he's like, what has happened in the past year of Beta Club? And it's like, nothing really. We kind of just
people got their hours.
We did our service hours and helped some people out, and I worked my tail off to keep a 3.5 GPA. But no, I mean, and I love Beta Club. I love being in it, and I take it seriously. But this guy is just like, you're a vampire cockroach, you know.
Well, to even want to be president of Beta Club and go through that whole hierarchy, you've already got to be a certain kind of person, anyways. Yeah.
So whatever.
Probably the future Karl Rove.
Right. That's what I'm saying. It's like people like that. It's like I'm just like. No, but I think about that every time I hear Memory Lane. I think of like, let's take a trip down Memory Lane in his voice, which I'm not even going to do the full impression that I could do because it would probably be kind of insulting. But anyway, nobody really knows who this guy is now. If you are listening to it, no offense to you, had a good time listening to you BS for like 30 minutes.
But, I mean, who knows? Maybe he's got a subpoena for January 6th that he has to answer.
Yeah, who knows?
I don't know.
Yeah.
No.
Anyways,
getting randomly political. Today is a bonus.
Hey, he was president of something. We got to be political about it.
Bonus.
Yeah, bonus.
Echo. On kind of
here,
right here. we're currently right here on just historical filmmaking. I love that we're going into that now. We've just recently done some like period piece / historical films, biopics. As we're going to get into, I feel like historical fiction, not just in film, but even in literature or whatever form of art you want to look at it as, is its whole spectrum and medium of storytelling. There's a lot of, like within any other form of storytelling, there's a lot of ins and outs, some rules to be broken or not broken. And so we're going to be talking about historical filmmaking, and which is really a big concept because so many movies actually already are just in historical, already historical films in some roundabout way. And films in of themselves just are works of history years later. I mean, in some ways, like something like, we're going to talk about this later, but something like The Wizard of Oz has a lot of things to tell us about what life was in 1939 when it come out. You know what I mean?
Or even what life was like in the late 19th century. If you're going by being based on
adapted,
populism.
being adapted from that book. But I mean,
yeah.
So like every film already exists in a historical context, whether it is just a movie that was contemporary and then years later we look back on it, or a film that is in the moment being made about a past
It's like what
period.
people say about movies. Joe Dante always says this. I mean, a lot of people say something like that. Movies are inherently political. Mm-hmm. Doesn't matter what they're about, even if they're apolitical. That in itself almost is a political stance.
It is.
So in that sense, and people say history is politics all the time. And it is, but it's other things too. But movies are history too, is what we're saying in its own way. So
very true.
But anyway, we'll get to that, I guess, in a few minutes after we get right here.
Yeah, we are indeed right here. So we're going to offer up some thoughts on some movies we recently saw.
Is this a Blue Plate special?
Oh.
Is it? Hang on.
Well, see, now this is new territory we're in right now because this is a bonus episode that we've never had the Blue Plate special before in our bonus episodes. But I'm glad Levi corrected me because even in a bonus episode, you've got to load up on that Blue Plate special.
Hi, Audrey. Norma. Have a cup of coffee, please. Sure.
I'll have what she's having.
Hey, who wants the large pepperoni? Coming up! Order up!
Order is right here.
Maybe that should be our official
Maybe.
thing. What
I
we
don't
say
know.
after. Anyways, a new movie you may have heard of, The Nightmare Before Christmas. We mentioned this a little bit last week when we were talking about Christmas movies. I actually haven't seen it in a few years myself. I'd like to rewatch it soonish. You recently showed it to your middle school classroom during lunch times. And we really just want to touch base. I mean, we barely mentioned this movie last week. We talked about Tim Burton, of course, in the past. Now, of course, Henry Selick was the guy who formerly directed Nightmare Before Christmas, but everybody calls it Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas. Everybody so associates it with Tim Burton, so we can dip back into the Tim Burton memory lane a
Also,
little bit here, too.
memory lane.
Yeah.
It was also co-adapted by Michael McDowell. Too.
Oh, really?
Which I did. I kind of always
that.
forget that, but
Okay.
yes, that's true. Like he kind of adapted the poem that Burton wrote that it was based on.
Adapted a poem. Yeah, that's interesting.
Exactly. Well,
yeah.
You're going to see some of my thoughts on that.
So, first thing I'll ask, just that age group, those middle schoolers, how many of them were actually even familiar with that movie at that point?
Quite a bit of them have seen it.
Okay.
A lot of them, they're like, oh, this is one of my favorite movies. It's a very, very, very extremely popular movie among everyone, but especially among people that age. And usually, if I would hazard to guess, I would think that that's randomly one of the things they would most associate Tim Burton with. Which that's not the case
I think most
me.
people would.
That's not as much the case with myself. Yeah. But yeah, so they were pretty familiar with it. They sat there and watched it, and were just watching it like it was a normal movie.
Right.
And I would pause every so often and be like, this is a bunch of freaks.
Yeah.
Just because I like to joke sometimes. Like,
what were your newest impressions yourself?
Well, I guess you kind of prompted me to want to talk about this on here.
Well, I just figured it was around Christmas would be a good chance to talk
about it. I've always really liked that movie a lot, and then I just watched it just this time, and I don't know. It just kind of rang pretty false to me as a whole product.
What about it?
Well, part of and I gave it like 3 out of 5. I think it's a good movie. I still like it, but I really started to kind of sit down and just think about it. I'm like, first of all, let's just start at its base level. I know it's an animated movie for children. I get it, whatever. But it bases itself upon the idea that there's the real world, which we see in the movie when he goes to deliver, when Jack Skellington, the Pumpkin King, goes to deliver the presents as Santa Claus, as Sandy Claus, as we know.
Mm-hmm.
And so we know there's a real world where there are people. There's also a reference in one of the songs early on when he's like, something, something Kentucky to Mr. Unlucky, or something that's like...
So Kentucky exists.
And he knows that Kentucky exists, so it's like, okay.
So Mitch McConnell is out there in this...
So, yes, then hamburgers. How many hamburgers you can eat?
Yeah.
Well, we were there, we saw it. Anyways, so we know that, but then there are separate realms where the holidays that people celebrate exist, which are all connected in a random forest area.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
That you can access by way of Halloween Town.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow.
Where it is Halloween.
Right.
Halloween, yeah.
Not Hellerween. Not a Joseph Hellerween.
Yeah.
We're not talking about Catch-22 here. Okay.
Yeah.
But like so you can go between these.
Yeah.
But so my question is, okay, so first of all, do all of I know some people are laughing out here about this, and I'm like going through the logic of this, but I'm genuinely like, what the hell is happening?
Yeah.
Like, you're able to go there from where the Halloween stuff is. So it's like, okay, is there a similar point of entry in the other realms? But there isn't, because if you remember when Skellington goes through the portal to go to Christmas Town, he just like appears out. There's no clearing and no door. How does he get back?
Yeah. There's a lot of very basic logic questions that this whole thing opens up.
And it all, ultimately, what I'm saying is it all rests upon the idea that it is just a very banal, basic, empty idea for a story of like, there are separate and also, another question I have about that. So if the people in these... Now, we clearly know that Santa Claus goes and delivers the presents. But in Halloween Town, do they go and spread Halloween cheer to the normal world? It didn't really seem that way. It seemed like they just kind of stayed to their own selves. Yeah. So it's like and the other. Now we know that the Easter Bunny exists because there's the moment where where that guy. The Easter Bunny, they steal the Easter Bunny and he comes back. So it's like, okay, so theoretically the Easter Bunny goes out of Easter Town or whatever you want to call that. By the way, no Jesus in here anywhere. Not that, whatever, I don't care, but, well, I do, but, like, it's like, that's not going to make sense, but it's like, okay, so what Christmas and Easter are actually about.
Tim Burton out on Jesus.
Right,
is what we're saying.
We know that. And Michael McDowell, of course, and probably Danny Elfman. The Schwein. But yeah, and like, it just seems very illogical that all these things exist. But it's ultimately, it literally sounds like, it was just a poem that sounded kind of cool, of The Nightmare Before Christmas. And there's this interplay between Christmas and Halloween. And there's a whole argument among people of when do you watch the movie, Halloween or Christmas? And we talked about this last week. I think you watch it at Christmas because it's kind of ultimately about learning about what the Christmas spirit is in a sort of way.
Like I said, my whole theory on that whole movie is, in many ways, it's about Halloween/horror people trying to ruin every other time of the year with their crap. You know
and that's what it is, ultimately, too, is that it's celebrating the macabre and trying to, like we talked about the Gremlins, insert that into a holiday that it shouldn't be. So
it's kind of like, and it's so ubiquitous now, but the whole idea of like creepy clowns, believe it or not, there was a time where clowns were supposed to be a relatively benign, happy thing. I'm not sure when exactly that transition occurred. I would imagine
probably in the 50s or 60s.
Well, definitely by the time of John Wayne Gacy. I would think maybe even slightly before that, but that was definitely kind of by that point.
Yeah.
But
sorry, I'm smashing a water bottle.
But now,
or even
but
with
now,
the Joker
I would,
its own
yeah,
way
yeah, go back even further. Well, even before that. You know, what was the movie that Joker was partially based on? The Last Laugh, or
The Man Who Laughs?
The Man Who Laughs, I think, maybe.
Well, he wasn't exactly a clown in that, I don't think, but...
That's true. It kind of had clownish-looking makeup, but yeah. But now I feel like it would be weird to think of a clown as anything other than that. Like, to just think of a clown as a nice, benign figure, I feel like it's the weirder thing now. I mean, it's a movie that I've always liked. And again, we grew up loving Tim Burton stuff throughout the 90s and the 2000s for the most part. And it's one thing, it's like I like some songs from it here or there.
It has way too many songs. Way too many songs.
I wonder, too, if in some ways...
For a 76-minute movie, it's like
way and it's
too
brief,
much.
I know the movie is. I wonder, too, if, like, you know, obviously Burton's frustrations with have music forced upon him at several points early on in his career, it was his chance for him and Elfman to start over from square one and say, all right, we just get to totally design all the music for this.
Yeah.
And didn't him and Elfman have like a minor falling out during the making of that movie, but then
I wasn't aware
there
of
was
that,
like a movie or two that he didn't score, but then he came back after that and they patched it up, I think. But and Elfman, he does the skeleton voice, or the singing voice.
Not the regular voice, yes. But you hear that more often almost than you do the regular voice. But but I felt another thing about the movie, I felt like there were a lot of moments that, just having seen Tim Burton's movies so many times, that I saw moments that it was weird because it was stop motion, but they were framed exactly like moments in his movies were.
Yeah, right.
Like, there's that moment, I don't know if you remember, where, like, Sally, voiced by Catherine O'Hara, family, sends that basket up to Jack, and he looks at it for a second and then looks back down, and it's just she's gone and the rope's there. Is literally almost framed like the moment where the thug at the beginning of Batman looks down and Batman's gone. Yeah. It's like certain stuff like that is so like minor and minuscule, but what I'm getting at there is that, and even like parts of the music itself, the Danny Elfman music, which, I mean, you hear any of that music, and to be honest, it all sounds kind of the same, but literally certain like cues and harmonies and stuff it literally sound exactly like stuff from other scores of his. So the whole movie feels like it's really operating on this is a Tim Burton movie for the first time truly in his career, and it isn't. It's a Henry Selick movie.
Yeah.
So it's like it's operating on this whole plane that I find frankly kind of annoying to watch. That it's like being what it is, and it's just kind of like I could just be watching Batman or Beetlejuice.
What do you think about,
whatever.
like, you know, feels like the fandom around this is among the strongest of his whole career, Burton's, and again, he didn't quite direct it, but it's so associated with him. Like, this thing has like been hot topicked and
it's
like
because
merchandised out the
It's like what you said. It's because the people who love it so much are the people who want to infect the rest of the year with their BS of Halloween. Yeah. That's what it's about.
/horror,
right? So
like stuff. Yeah.
So those are the people we have to take to task here.
Yeah.
I mean, and don't get me wrong, I still like the movie. I was laughing through parts of it, just different stuff like, I looked behind the Cyclops' eye. I did.
Yeah, we quote a random
there,
random amount of the movie.
Yeah, my favorite stuff are the vampires because they're just so weird.
Yeah.
Stuff like I'm the clown with the tearaway face, here in a flash and gone without a trace. Like, we say that all the time.
Yeah.
But no, there's stuff that I think is really funny and we laugh about, and it is an interesting movie. But I don't know, it just feels pretty hollow to me watching it.
Well, again,
and
it feels
I'm
like
just
something that, like, it's like a, you're talking about it's based on a quote, a poem. It feels like storyboards come to life, and it's like logic's out the window. It's just like a way to just like express this like ironic idea of, again, juxtaposing Christmas against Halloween. Their proximity in the year is always something that's there anyways.
And then
Thanksgiving gets just short shrift as usual.
No, I mean, and it's like the same. Another thing about the movie I wonder about is the Oogie Boogie character, who's a big question mark overall. But that it's that he's like a are you a gambling man, Santa Claus? It's like he's got this whole gambling theme to himself, and it's just like, what? Like, why is that in this movie? There's just a lot of weird question marks that are just, I don't know.
It gets re-released almost every year. I mean, so it's just a widely...
What, in movie theaters?
Yeah. I
didn't know that.
Yeah, almost every year, and it's got like a sing-along version too, where it's like got the...
Yeah. The bouncing ball, which we need to follow, as Thomas Pynchon once wrote.
Yeah.
So,
I haven't seen it in a while myself, but
I don't know.
I don't know what he thinks about that movie.
He probably doesn't even know it exists. I'm sure he does, but
probably his kids watch it.
Yeah, he's like, man, this is kind of dumb. But no, I mean, it's a good enough movie. I'm not trying to make people mad. Believe me, I didn't get on here to be like, if you love this movie, you're an idiot or anything. Whatever.
Nah, I just read your Letterboxd review, and I was like, oh, it's maybe a chance to maybe talk about that a little bit. I need to rewatch it again myself.
I mean, it's fine. It just, I mean, like I said, I'm not trying to poke holes in a movie that is inherently illogical, but, like, there's just a lot of stuff about, like, I'm just confused about the premise. Yeah. It's like, well, I don't get how these pastiches just exist on their own, but also exist in the world itself.
Yeah, maybe it could have done something where it was, like, that they all do, like, go into the, quote, the real world, but they're not really aware of the existence of the other ones until somehow Jack comes across it and realizes that, and then he goes between. I don't know. So there's some fairly minor ways they could have actually had some more of a logical.
And there's a base theme of the movie, which is that it's like that you should stay with what you know, and if you're good at one thing, keep with that or whatever. Which I don't think is a bad thing necessarily, but it's kind of just like, okay, but also you should try other things too, and it almost in itself is, like you said, encouraging the behavior of its fans to be, I'm going to be weird all the time. It's like, whatever. I don't know.
I'm sure just this week, whether you've known it or not, you've walked by somebody who had a Jack Skellington hoodie on.
There's a girl in one of my classes that has a Jack Skellington book bag all year.
Yeah.
So
there you go.
So if you're listening, that person, hello.
How you doing?
Hey.
So another movie we both recently saw for the first time, My Winnipeg.
Dip into the layers of Winnipeg.
Yeah. From Guy Maddin.
Yeah.
I think the movie came out in what, like
2007. Another 2007 movie.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Now, I know a movie like that, the release had to have been odd because it probably played at festivals and maybe had a minor release in Canada. He is primarily a Canadian filmmaker. He's from Canada, Guy Maddin. We've been streaming some of his stuff for a little while now off the Criterion channel. So what have we seen? We've seen Archangel.
Careful. Saddest Music in the World, and then this.
Yeah. So this is only our fourth film from him. It was kind of one of the, quote, big fish, so to speak, because it's like one of the handful of ones I think that are really
not to be confused with Tim Burton's Big
Fish.
Fish.
Yeah, but just like one of the big whales of his career. So it was something I was highly anticipating, and we both absolutely loved.
Mm-hmm.
What about this movie for you was a bit of a evolution in kind of Guy Maddin's sensibilities? Because he has a very specific aesthetic and sensibility.
Well, I really, really loved The Saddest Music in the World, which I still think a lot of. And I think what I love about that movie is that it is taking the era of
the
30s and the Depression, but putting it in a different country, and kind of having this whole idea of we're all very sad, so let's have a competition about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
it's a very absurd.
Yeah,
idea,
it's like, but I think it fits also the era of trying to commoditize suffering in a way that cinema did in a certain way too. And his movies are very much, I mean, he made Careful, which is a lot about like the German mountain film, kind of like some of the early things Leni Riefenstahl would have made, I think, and that's in itself a whole genre. So he's very much, you know,
his films are very much the style is homage to silent film, but also early sound film, teens, 20s, 30s, and all of his films kind of almost appropriate a lost film aesthetic. It's almost like a film that if you blink twice, you could have imagined having existed back then.
Yeah.
But in many ways, they're actually, of course, pastiches and homages, and so they're very much modern interpretations of those styles.
Yeah. And let me say real quickly, too, that screw Leni Riefenstahl, I'm going to be spending part of this week to rip her a new one for my kids at school as we're talking about World War II. But anyway, I just want to make that clear so nobody was confused. But anyways, but so his movies have operated on this kind of very specific, like, all period pieces, all, like, you know, based on this kind of older mode of classic, not even classic Hollywood, just classical filmmaking, you know, early silent films and early talkies. But that this, and it still operates on a lot of the same stylistic flourishes, and is primarily in black and white, as most of his films are. But because even like
flashes of color in the
even even the Forbidden Room, which I haven't seen all of, but I've seen some of, is kind of based on a kind of very old 3-strip Technicolor. But that movie was shot in digital, supposedly, but they kind of worked to make it look that way. But that this movie, what I think is so important about it is that, first of all, you hear his voice the whole time. He's the narrator of the movie. And the movie's literally called My Winnipeg, so it's saying this is a documentary, but it is also about almost a fictional version of him questioning, and himself questioning, why do I stay in this city that is so cold and kind of
miserable,
barren, and just like culturally, I don't want to say culturally useless, but he even talks about the way that he had a whole kind of, it's interesting, there's a kind of, the movie's very essayistic, it kind of has sections to it where he talks about one thing. He talked for a while about hockey, which of course any, you know, Canadian will probably talk about, but how Winnipeg used to be a kind of center for hockey, or a big center for hockey, and that the NHL, what she kept demonizing the NHL the whole time about, they're awful or whatever, that they had kind of commoditized so many of the smaller kind of hockey clubs that they had basically moved some of the teams away to Phoenix, I think. That team that was in Winnipeg, they moved somewhere crazy, like
Phoenix, Arizona, in the middle of the desert.
I don't remember if that's where it was, but it was something like that. Yeah. And that the old, because the whole kind of point of that section was talking about the old hockey stadium, they like demolished and built a new one, which was intended to be another center of hockey. But at that time, he was like suspicious of whether that would happen. Now they have kind of moved back there and had some hockey stuff. I looked into it, but that's a really interesting section of the movie. But that the whole movie, it operates on these different things, but ultimately it's questioning, like, what is my existence in this town? So then he proceeds to like recreate scenes from his life,
specifically his childhood,
his childhood in what was supposedly the old house he lived in, which was also a like hair salon. And it's like has Anne Savage as his playing his mother. Who in herself is playing herself in these like film.
Well, I was gonna say the very movie, the whole movie tips its hand at the very beginning. It starts off with like him directing her on how to read a line. And right from the very beginning, that gives us an idea of the blending of fact and fiction and myth and reality are going to be very fluid in this film. Because one thing that really struck me about this movie is you hear directors all the time describe films as, quote, autobiographical. I think one that really jumps to mind when I think of that designation is something like 400 Blows, about Truffaut's essentially his childhood and his attempt to kind of make a movie about his childhood. And so we've had directors, of course, make films kind of about themselves here or there. But I've never seen anything quite like this, where it's almost this, tactful acknowledgement on his part that he's still searching for answers as to kind of why he loves and lives in this place. And as someone who ourselves come from a little bit more of a rural area, not necessarily the severity of the weather of Winnipeg and Canada, but in Western North Carolina, I myself have often asked some of the same questions. Why do I love this place that on the surface most people would just see as a place between here or there? And I just found it to be a very wildly beautiful film. It's not all that long either. It's like, 80-some minutes. And for me, what was really great about it was, as much as I've really liked or close to loving something like Saddest Music in the World, his other films, is that it always felt like he was, putting on his parents' clothes almost in those other films, not literally his own parents, but like, oh, I'm going to like try on this style or this genre or be this homage. And it didn't really feel like a kid. It was a kid trying out something that an adult would do, but like he himself had a certain remove or disconnection behind. This felt like him really, actually, instead of trying on his clothes, trying on his parents' clothes, like he was taking you through all these pictures in his like family living room of, oh, this was so and so, this, and it had this. Again, his narration, the fact that it was him, I think added this sense of personality to it and this personal nature. And who's to say that there are certain things that he changed or lied about or just did something a little different. And that almost adds to the selective nature through which we ourselves always remember or put certain things on pedestals. And I feel like the whole movie was in many ways kind of an acknowledgement of that and a grappling with him of how he has contextualized his own past and how that past is still very much alive for him in a city like Winnipeg that on the surface most people who aren't from there would just see as a frozen hell, but for him he sees as his own sort of frozen refuge or heaven.
Well, and then at the same time, also a whole part of the movie and kind of theme of the movie is this undercurrent of it as a supernatural city. He talks a lot about these different like occult things that have happened there, but he even talks about how like it kind of sits at the bend of these two rivers and how that immediately makes the city a kind of supernatural thing. He talks that whole section about one of the most interesting sections of the movie about that 3-level pool where there's like a pool in the city that has 3 pools in it and it's like all on top of the other, basically the floors. Yeah. And that the one in the bottom was the boys' pool. And it was like talking about all the weird stuff that would go on down there, just stuff that the kids would do, and that they thought that the water itself literally was coming from under the ground, and that made it like a supernatural like place. So it is interesting, that he paints it as a I wouldn't even say exactly a happy place, but a safe place and a secure place for himself, but also a kind of like I'm trying to think how to say it, like a cheerfully dark place and like just kind of a strange place.
There's probably a way for him. I mean, every little geographical area has their own little myths and legends about this, like the Brown Mountain Lights or like whatever things go around here we have in Western North Carolina. And so I think that was a way for him to also maybe chronicle the city in some way.
Or Tom, there's a famous song about Tom Dooley or whatever. He's supposedly buried out over in, like, I guess going towards Wilkesboro area. So, I mean, we have our own stuff around here that exists that is similar with anywhere. But,
you see a movie like this that's so bold and kind of autobiographical, memoiristic, and also, like, about this region that I'd almost love to see a series of films all across America. I'm looking at America, but really the world even, and just, like, versions of this, but from other filmmakers' perspectives. But you can't kind of do another version of Guy Maddin because Guy Maddin's just so idiosyncratic and dark and beautiful in his own way. So totally love that. Recommend watching it again. We streamed it off the Criterion channel, and they put out a disc of it some years ago, I think, too. And again, every time I watch another movie of his, I just get more excited by him. And so I doubt necessarily I'll see another movie of his that touches this exactly, but just to see some other examples. Again, I'm really interested to see Forbidden Room. Yeah. I know kind of what that's about. So check that out if you're able. But we thought that would be a good way to kind of dovetail into our topic of the day, because in many ways that movie is not, what is it? Is it a documentary? Is it a mockumentary? I think a lot of people describe it as a mockumentary. It's about kind of the history of this place, Winnipeg, but told through this very personal direction. And so much of historical filmmaking is, in many ways, versions of that as well, where it tries to posit this big objective truth or idea, but in reality, I think most of the best historical films, whether you agree with their messages or not, themselves are putting out a very specific interpretation or theme about a certain time period in the study of it. Again, we're both historically minded people. I'm a social studies, American history teacher.
I'm an undercover social studies teacher.
Yeah, undercover. Now you're a 7th grade ELA teacher, but you went to school to be a social studies teacher, and maybe one day will be. What are just some, when you think about it, not necessarily from our perspective, but just from the culture or larger culture, what are some, quote, tropes you think most people associate with, quote, historical films?
Well, most of them are movies like Unbroken or Race or, I'm thinking of modern examples, Free State of Jones, stuff like this that's like very much like the untold story of, or like Midway, the new Midway, not the old Midway. This new one was called Midway, right? Okay. Movies like that are very much like a pop history, making it into a more glossy version of what it is. Then you have the a little bit more arty, like historical dramas or whatever.
Costume dramas.
But like, usually. So what was your question? I guess what
are some tropes you think people associate with these type of films? I think for one, they're like awards baity.
Yes,
they're going to just be making.
And they're usually war
awards.
movies. A lot of people look at, and we want to make a distinction about what that is exactly too. But usually they're like, or they're about a person. It's a biopic or whatever.
Yeah.
And like you said, they're usually awards bait, or they're kind of played as like pseudo action movies. Or dramas, and so I guess tropes, like I said, when I think of that, I think of the untold story of, nowadays at least, like The Monuments Men, which neither of us have seen, but these are people's lives or whatever. You steal people's lives. But that usually, I guess that's the type of tropes, I guess, if that's what you mean, is like that they fall into a lot of the same ways of doing things like that. Or even a movie as great as Lincoln, which I think is kind of a blueprint both for how it should be done and kind of how it's always done at the same way of like, we have this thing we need to do and we need to work to get there, and then was it realized? I don't know, and so I guess that's an answer to that.
And I think, like I said, like historical dramas are one of the few. I mean, I feel like let me backtrack a little bit. You can go all the way to the beginning of Hollywood's history. I mean, some of the earliest movies, like the Great Train Robbery. I mean, that was already westerns. Already were being historically thought about in the early 1900s, like 1900s, 19-teens, even 1920s. And in many ways, that was a carryover from the Wild West shows that were big in the late 19th century. That was already memorializing the quote Wild West, which was in its kind of decline by that point as a concept or as an idea. And I think really, I think that a seed was certainly planted there, but that you certainly see. Even, not always, but through even today, with a lot of historical films, is a certain level of like literary romanticism, like kind of the idea of time was maybe quote simpler at this time, or back in this time there were open ranges and like you just didn't have the same constrictions you do today. Anyone who's a student of history knows that's in many ways a lie, in many ways that's a myth. And for anyone it was a, quote, simpler time for, there was always infinitely more people that it was
even with the West,
tougher.
The corporations got there first and made it what it is. I mean...
the railroads were the ones who really were dictating so much policy as far as a lot of that stuff goes.
I mean, you literally look at the West geographically. Just look at the West and then look over at the eastern part of the country. And the eastern part of the country follows all these very weird lines, and it looks like it follows rivers and all this stuff. Then you get out there, and it's just these boxes that they drew. said, let's divide this up. If that isn't the most capitalist corporate thing I've ever seen, I mean,
it's pure consolidation.
right? And it's just like, here's how much land you can get. It's just a bunch of boxes of stuff.
And we didn't really talk about Westerns as a specific genre, kind of planning this episode, but I think the Western is the one that is most implicitly connected to the historical film because it is inherently mostly a historical genre. Now you have neo-Westerns and like Westerns that are functionally modern films, but in many ways Westerns, something like Hell or High Water, I mean, that's a Western through and through. It just happens to take place in the modern day. Something like, say, No Country for Old Men, you know, even that's a period piece also as a Western, you know what I mean? It was released in 2007, but it's about like 1980, but then in many ways it still is a embodiment of like these old Wild West traditions. What about Westerns as a genre work for you in terms of depicting history or kind of giving history of kind of specifically American history its place? Because in many ways the American Western is one of American cinema's largest contributions to the international film scene.
Yeah,
you know,
I guess that part of it, and
because you've been somebody, let me just say, who you've sometimes rejected the romanticism of like a certain eras of Westerns.
Yes. I have trouble with that because, like I said, I recognize, I think one of the best Westerns in this sense is McCabe Mrs. Miller, because it is one of the few Westerns I've ever seen that immediately recognizes, maybe even a movie like Wild Wild West, recognizes the corporatism of the West, and that there's this whole, what I love about McCabe Mrs. Miller, maybe we can go ahead and talk about this as a historical movie, I guess. That wasn't one I even picked, but I'm just now thinking of. That movie...
All roads lead to Altman on this podcast.
That basically is saying, well, here's this folksy kind of redneck Western guy, and he owns some brothels and is a trickster and a con man, but he's got a heart, you know.
Yeah.
Not really, but you know. And then that the corporate capitalist guys that come in and like oh gosh, what's his name?
Murphy.
Michael Murphy.
Yeah.
He says some stuff that other, like, he says that if Beatty says that thing about if a frog could fly, it wouldn't bump its ass so much.
Yeah.
You follow me? And like,
there's been other times,
the Renee Abenjois character's like,
nobody's challenged him on
that.
that.
And then Michael Murphy's like, wait, what?
Yeah.
He's like, and basically this whole idea of like, this whole game you've got going ain't gonna work with us. So we're like, we don't think you're funny, we don't like you, and we will kill you to get what we want. Like, you know. So that whole idea, I think, is a very important historical idea to kind of get rid of the fallacy of the West as this, like, folk saga of history. That it was in certain ways, but also, other than just being a lie for most, even white people, or white men specifically, or rich white men, even more specifically, that... for women and minorities like Native Americans or blacks or whoever, that was not ever the case.
Latinos,
so, and yes, and Hispanics. But that, so that I think is important. But so that's part of what my problem with the romantic Western is it kind of tries to, first of all, always paints the Native Americans as the enemy in most of these.
I mean, I love a movie like this, but say like Red River.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just totally like, to call them the villains even overstates how the movie would categorize them. They're just in the way of like, well, we got to get this cattle over here, and then we have these Native American attacks, and so just like, they're no different than a hurricane or a tornado that's coming through, just something we just have to keep at bay. We don't even consider them really humans. Something like...
Red River, Stagecoach.
Well, The Searchers is a movie we've talked a lot about. John Ford is... Now, I will say, like, I think Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is in many ways him starting to reckon a little bit more with some of these very ideas.
Well, I really like My Darling Clementine also, so I think that's really good.
But The Searchers is a good example that, you know, there's been debates a long, long time about whether the movie itself is racist or whether John Wayne's character is racist and it is just about depicting his character. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And this isn't a period piece at all, but later on, like something like Taxi Driver has had similar debates about that. And of course, Martin Scorsese is a huge fan of The Searchers. So, in many ways, I think him and Schrader have said To them, Taxi Drivers is the 70s version of The Searchers in its own way.
Well, he's searching to save a girl, too, so yeah.
But obviously, in that movie, John Wayne's character is wildly racist, and that he like goes out of his way to like disrespect even the corpses of some of the Native Americans he fights, not even because he believes in their spirituality, but to just deprive them even from the grave of any sense of calm or peace. That's just a certain level of racism that I don't think it's hard to even really wrap your head around.
Yeah.
And so again, the Western has always, like I said, from the very beginning of cinema, from like Great Train Robbery, has been one of those genres that is inherently about depicting and contextualizing history.
And let me real quickly use The Searchers as an example about why I have some trouble with the romantic Western. Because half of the movie is not that. Half of the movie is edging towards a sort of Sam Peckinpah-ization of the revisionist Western, as far as the idea that, like, and let me say, I don't know whether, I mean, the movie itself is kind of racist, I guess, because of the way it depicts the Native Americans, but, I mean, the movie clearly is, I think, seeing him as very much an anti-hero, if it sees him as a hero at all. I mean, part of the whole point of the movie is questioning, why are you so dedicated to even saving this girl when you should just accept that she's gone after a while? And he spends, like, is it like 8 years or something? I don't really remember.
For a long period of time.
Searching the West for that girl. And I find that to be a very compelling story, actually. And find it interesting to have a character that is that outwardly evil, being obsessed with finding a person, and it's like an early version of Taxi Driver. It really is, where you like feel uncomfortable about the whole situation. But then you have the parts of the movie where it's the family, like, oh, we got a letter from them. Here's what they're doing. Oh, they saw some buffalo and had some fun, or what? And it's just, that's my problem with the romantic Western, because it wants to put a glossy kind of, oh, but everything's okay. Don't worry about it. It'll all be all right. Like, no, it needs to just be bad. That's what and that's what that movie called for. But it was frankly made too early. Like, So,
well, some people have now looked back, it should be said, on something like The Searchers and said maybe this movie isn't as romantic as people, because I think it was mostly called romantic in the wake of the spaghetti westerns, the revisionist westerns of the 60s going into the 70s, that people were already looking back at a movie like that and saying, oh, this is more romantic. But then even more years have passed, and people have even started to question whether it was romantic as people were saying it was in the 60s and 70s.
Well, and there have been movies like The Naked Spur, even before that, that were edging towards a more revisionist.
Anthony Mann's, Naked Spur, which is really good.
Yeah, and then even you've seen Winchester 73.
Both of those are like noirish westerns, to say the least, of the film noir kind of having an impact on that. All this is to say that, what's funny is like all these films are being depicted about roughly the same time period, but literally as literal time is going by, we're already finding new ways to look at this. And that's ultimately what all history is all about, is these events have already happened. And so in many ways, historical filmmaking, historical fiction, whatever, tells us less honestly about the actual time period it is supposed to be about than it is the time period in which it is being made. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that applies to most historical films too.
I'll interject quickly also that Samuel Fuller's westerns that I have seen are a little bit more, just a tad more revisionist than some of the others. I Shot Jesse James or even The Baron of Arizona. I feel like 40 Guns goes a little bit more into the romantic western category than those two do. But
and I feel like something like McKay, Mrs. Miller to me is the platonic ideal of the revisionist western, because I deeply love the Leone,
Spaghetti
Eastwood, Spaghetti, like that trilogy specifically. I mean, Good, Bad, the Ugly, one of the greatest films ever made. Not exactly accurate to the, quote, Wild West as we know it, but that's fine, because that's like him taking a pastiche. Is that even okay, though, to you, to just take something like the Civil War or take something like what that time period was and say, well, we're just going to kind of do because there were people who honestly saw the spaghetti westerns as a mockery of the Western. How can you take this form and just do something this wild and crazy with it? What's your own interpretation of that?
On that in general,
and just
then
how
also
that,
the Civil War?
Well, specifically, this goes into a bigger discussion of we could skip down a little bit asking this question. What does film owe to history? Does film have to be, quote, historically accurate, or can it take history merely as a medium through which to kind of explode and do all these other things with it?
Well, I said
several
this last
questions within
week.
that,
It doesn't owe anything to history.
Mm-hmm.
Movies are artistic statements, and anyone who claims to believe that history and movies are definitively the case always, well, you're just foolish. I mean, you have to come to a realization that movies are fiction. They can reflect things about history, like we said about McKay and Mrs. Miller, about that's a very specific idea about this is actually what the West is.
Yeah.
And that's fine, and there can be movies that are biopics and, inspired by, and I get that. But, I mean, even if you go back to a movie like Sergeant York, I mean, I haven't even seen that movie, but I'm aware of who Alvin York is and what his whole kind of cult of mythologization is. I mean, that's propaganda for World War II in itself.
Yeah, it was made during World War II, but about World War I. And even then, you can see, and I've seen it, and I quite like it, actually, you can see revisionism happening in the moment from something that didn't happen 20 years ago about.
So, I mean, all these things are made in context and time periods of, we believe this. I mean, we talked about MASH. That wasn't a movie I included either. But that movie is about Korea, but it's really about Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And so, movies in themselves make statements about these things. But, I mean, it's intended to entertain. It's popular history. It's not... Yeah. I mean, if you got somebody... I mean, now, something like Gettysburg, which is one of the movies that was on my list we'll talk about later. But that movie is very much trying to be like, no, this is actually what happened at Gettysburg. Yeah. I haven't talked to a Gettysburg, expert. I know one or two.
Yeah.
But... I haven't talked to them, and what I've talked to them about the movie, they said they really love it. So,
But it should be said that even that movie is technically based on The Killer Angels, a novel.
Yes.
Which in and of itself is certainly tethered in based on fact, but is still a work of fiction.
But so unless you're a movie like that or you're a straight up docudrama, then you're probably not going to get everything exactly right. But that's not, like I said, that's not what the point of a movie is. It's to entertain people and to impart at least a little bit of history or wisdom.
Or that's just a curiosity that person goes out and
or a
searches
thematic
for themselves.
Statement about history that is a truth. But not all history movies are created equal, and we'll kind of talk about that as we go. But to jump back to your Western question, I don't think that there's anything sacred about the Western, that it should be, that the spaghetti Western is a mockery of that. That's just ridiculous.
I'm just telling you what critics
right. No,
of the
I know
time
what
were saying
people
in the
think.
60s,
but now I get
and
it.
A vulgarization of the former,
and you don't have
said.
to vulgarization of the Western. That's just the most laughable thing I've ever heard. But no, I mean, and I understand why that was a thing at the time, because Westerns were this that was like you went to church on Sunday and then you went to church on the day before to go see a Western. I mean, that was like the gospel to most of America, and most of America, similarly has conflated John Wayne with Jesus, which what a sick, perverted idea that is.
Yeah. Go look up his Playboy interview.
I mean, there's
the
literally a
70s
book. I think there's literally a book called something like John Wayne and Jesus or something that is like saying it's saying like the bastardization of Christianity through that lens.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I see, and I mean I see it as an improvement somewhat, because even in its own way, at its goofiest, those movies are saying. It's weird because it's kind of having it both ways, because it's like, look at how stupid and kind of goofy the West is, but then it's like, but look at how violent it is too. And it kind of lives in these two contradictions of the romantic Western at the same time. It's very strange. And I know and it's still shocking to watch now. We've mostly only seen the Leone Westerns. I know there's some of those Corbucci Django movies and some other movies I've seen stuff from. I'm like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Or even I haven't seen it, but Duck You Sucker, some stuff from that I'm like, is this really in a movie? And it's like, you look at the poster of that and it's like James Coburn with like dynamite on his coat, and it's just like, what? But
I do think too, also critically and even industrially, Hollywood and like kind of the professional critics were frankly a little alarmed that like another national
Yeah.
cinema was having its take on the Western. I think too,
Oh, God
like
forbid.
oh, that's our thing, and here they are coming in and taking that.
Well, and
you
it's
know what
like
I mean?
how people
And I feel
felt-
like in a lot of ways, obviously, the samurai movie from
Yes.
Japan is frankly more reverent towards the Western, even than like say the Italian.
Yes.
Spaghetti
Well, and that was
Westerns
part
are.
of the problem with Kurosawa is that in Japan, a lot of people didn't like his movies because they were too Western. And part of me didn't understand that, and I don't mean Western in the sense of like
The Western
even the
genre,
Western. I
but
mean they are
Western
too American.
civilization,
Like, yes.
like, yeah.
And I thought that was weird because I was like, well, I haven't ever seen any other Japanese movies. Then you see something like Branded to Kill. Now, granted, that's a little further on, but you're like, yeah, this feels very like this is a Japanese product. Like, it is not a Western product. But then that has gone on to, influence so many other American films, and same thing with samurai movies. But that like you said, has had its own influence and was influenced by that. To jump,
And then, quickly,
Yeah.
and then like those Japanese movies that were inspired by some Westerns then went on to inspire in some ways some of even the Italian spaghetti Westerns, but even then American Westerns. So I think that's actually kind of exciting that you have all these national cinemas kind of implicitly having a conversation and kind of pushing the other ones forward,
And so, to jump back down into the question of what I feel about the Civil War and the good, the bad, and the ugly, you'd be surprised probably to hear me say I don't think there's any problem with it because of what the movie is inherently a nihilistic, frankly goofy take on the Civil War. Because I mean, literally, the tagline is for them it wasn't a war; it was practice or whatever.
War wasn't hell; it was practice.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what it was. But that it's like also it's in a theater of the war that we don't really care and talk much
the most
about,
farthest
in like
west
Texas
version,
and New Mexico. But that the movie is inherently staked its whole point on the fact of it's being very apolitical, which is in itself, like I said, a political statement, but it's like stepping back from what the war was about, which people conveniently have done for since the war ended.
Yeah.
Even I was going to say even up until then, even up until now, conveniently continue to step away from what that war was about. But that it's just saying Confederate gold, they want it.
Yeah.
And it's just like it shows how much that really implicitly it's even teaching us about the war almost in a way, how much even the people who fought in it didn't really care what it was.
Yeah.
They saw it as an opportunity.
Some people didn't, yeah.
Right. They saw it as
Most
an opportunity to get something out of it, or just they had to survive through it because they were conscripted. But for them, it's all seen as, well, we're not going to participate in that other than the fact that we want this money.
And I do think also Leone gets a little bit of an out as an Italian making this movie.
Yeah.
That there is a certain level of remove that I feel like an American filmmaker would either A, engage in a lost cause narrative, which is the case with a lot of Westerns in general with the Confederacy, or make it about the Union is the supreme one, and Union is the supreme righteous cause. And again, being Italian, removed from it, he just sees it as like a conflict that is happening in the background to then put this story in the middle of it, which I think we could jump over and talk about this movie a little bit in this regard. I think Apocalypse Now does a similar thing with the Vietnam War. That is not a movie really seriously interested, I don't think, in the Vietnam War and what that was, quote, about, other than partially the, like, excised, like, French plantation stuff, which is only in really the Redux.
What that movie's making a statement about is the idea that the Vietnam War, the whole central question of the movie is taking from Heart of Darkness, but putting it on the Vietnam War and saying, what is madness?
Oh, the timeless nature of war and timeless nature of madness.
And it's saying, so we call this man mad, but yet we do this. Yeah. And it's like, I mean, that's
the contradictions
in that
and the
sense, it is about Vietnam, but not really. So
but it's not getting in the nitty gritty about what the South wants, what the North wants, what the Viet Cong
But it is
want.
making a historical statement about the nihilism of that era.
Yeah. But I'm saying it's not as explicit as some other films of that time period that are actually trying to.
In The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly,
things.
some of the most specific ideas it postulates about the Civil War, like, look at General Sibley, he looks dead. Like, the way that guy talks, hooray for Dixie, hooray, hooray for Dixie. please, sir, a bad heart, or whatever he says. And then I love that guy later in the movie that's that, like, Union general who's, like, drinking the whole time, where they go to that bridge, and he's like, what are your names, or whatever, and they're like, and now we're just making this into a dub, making fun of the dub, and they're like they don't want to give their names. He's like, no. Like, you know, he's like, yeah, what? He's like, it doesn't matter, or whatever, and then, like, he, like, is dying basically from being shot at, and he sees that the bridge explodes. Yeah. And that's almost a statement in itself about the movie, is that he's just, like, totally drunk, ridiculous individual who doesn't seem to really care about anything this is about, and that he kind of says something about, oh, they did fall over that bridge for a really long period of time, and he's just saying, I wish somebody would just go blow that up so we didn't have to worry about it anymore. And that he sees that happen and smiles right before his death, because he's like, finally, this whole thing is over. It's not even, he didn't even care about the ideology. He was just tired of doing it. And in itself, that is in a very weird, like we said, apolitical statement that is political in itself, of, like, saying, I just want to be free of this, like, nonsense, you know.
Something you said earlier I think is very true. I think probably, other than the Western, the war film is probably the most explicitly historical genre. I mean, you have some contemporary war films, but and I feel like even something like, say, American Sniper, which was a more modern war film, more modern film, technically a period piece, but functionally about even the ongoing war on terror at that point. We can talk about the distinguishing within these subgenres of war films, or within historical films, I could say, because I feel like what would classify something as a historical film versus a period piece versus a costume drama versus a war film versus a biopic? Because I think a biopic is another inherently historical form.
I think that, I guess the way that I typify a historical film is I feel like it has to make a statement about
it has
history.
A thesis, its own thesis on history, or a person, or about
and
an
that
idea.
Therefore some war films I don't feel like do that. As great as the 1-2 punch around that time of
Saving
the
Private
Thin Red
Ryan
Line and Saving Private Ryan, they're not really about history.
Yeah.
They're about the experience of what it was like to live in it in a certain way. Although the Thin Red Line is about the experience of war, but it's kind of more than that. It's about a life experience, I guess, in general, and existentialism.
I feel like in a weird way, Saving Private Ryan is more, quote, about World War II, and kind of, I wouldn't hazard to say necessarily exploring the themes of World War II on a deep level, even though the filmmaking is superb, obviously. You know, a movie that I think gets a little bit of short shrift in this regard, even though everybody loved it from a few years ago, something like Dunkirk. I think the way I think that's one of a handful of movies I always show my kids in school.
I'll be starting it tomorrow.
And the reason I do is because while the movie, they're not having a lot of conversations about what Nazism is and what, like, France is about to be just, annihilated by the Germans and all this, but the way I remember David Ehrlich, I know he said in his review, and I always remember it from Dunkirk, he said something along the lines of, like, you never see their faces. Like, you never see, really, the Germans as soldiers, really. The only time you even really see the Germans as soldiers is literally at the very end when Tom Hardy's been captured by them. And you don't even really see their faces. You just see the helmets, and it's all from this kind of remove. But what I really deeply love about that film is it depicts Nazism as a hurricane-level event. It depicts Nazism as this asteroid that's hurtling towards Earth and this ticking clock. We have to get all these British troops back across the channel so we can prepare for what we know is coming. And I think...
Well, and at the beginning of the movie, just the level of hatred that you have to have as an ideology they literally print those leaflets that say, we surround you on it, and they literally dropped it over Dunkirk so that they would see that. And that was in itself a weapon,
psychological.
And that, like, just it presents itself, like you said, as like a weather event.
It's like a disaster. It feels like a disaster film, but it's not an asteroid hurtling towards Earth. It's Nazism hurtling toward these guys. And you get, again, you're not having all these big, high-minded discussions about this or that, and I think
Right.
in some ways other war films do. But it is presenting you with a feeling and a sensation that is in of itself a thesis and an idea.
Yeah.
And I think, I feel like, he's already made some great films, Nolan, but that was a huge step forward for him to kind of, his movies have kind of getting a little longer, and I love a lot of them, something like Interstellar I adore, but like, that was like this back to basics, look at how stripped down and specific this is, and then it was like with Tenet,
longer again.
He lost his what he had learned or whatever, And he's getting ready to do a J. Robert Oppenheimer movie.
Yeah.
Which is going to be very curious to see how he's already made a World War II film, how he returns to that time period and what else he's going to have new to say. Cillian Murphy also going to be in there.
Yeah.
But,
and I think that, so getting back to that, you're right. I think that with that movie, it is making a definitive statement about a feeling of history.
Or sensation,
So in that sense, it is that.
Yeah.
But yeah, with a lot of war movies, it's just like we have to get to point A to point B, and you kind of have some stuff that happens along the way where they talk about some stuff, but it's not really making a statement or
if anything else, something like Saving Private Ryan is more about getting you, and you've seen Band of Brothers.
Well, I'm going to talk about that here in a second.
That it's about the sensation of what it was like of these guys to be living on top of each other and the brotherhood and the camaraderie that comes from that.
Yes.
That in of itself, I guess, is also a timeless thing about war, but is specific maybe to that war.
And in that sense, going back to Band of Brothers, or introducing it, you mentioned it, but I am about halfway, a little less than halfway through that. Without hyperbole, I think that's one of the best TV shows I've ever seen. Especially
where's it also ranked for you in terms of World War II of film or like film TV?
I think it's about as top of the top as you can get. It's pretty much that and Thin Red Line and Saving Private Ryan in its own way. I mean, it all came out of that Saving Private Ryan kind of production cycle, I guess you call it.
Yeah.
But so that is like Saving Private Ryan, where it's more about the experience. I mean, it's literally called Band of Brothers, and having a whole idea of a brotherhood of people having to work together all this time, and how you feel when someone is dead. They're alive one minute, and they're like one of your best friends, and they're just gone.
Right.
But and I feel like it should do that a little more because, that's one little thing about it is that there are certain characters you can tell the way that the camera is on them, they're going to be there for a while. Like,
like Donnie Wahlberg, he's going to be
like,
around for a while.
It was a really good kind of little section of it last night or yesterday. I watched the episode where they dropped into Holland, and it was called Operation Market Garden. It actually overall was a failure, but it was basically where the British and the Americans kind of came together as a paratrooper unit and paratrooped into Holland. They were going to take it from the Nazis and try to go that way into Germany instead of through France. It didn't really work because they underestimated the Nazi willingness to keep that. They thought it was mostly older men and younger boys, but it was actually pretty well-trained German soldiers that were there. But anyway, there's a whole little section of it that's about a guy that gets left behind. They try to, invade this little town, and it all goes crappy because this their tanks that they've got with them are these British guys, and they're saying, hey, there's a tank over there near the house that you need to take out right now. Just shoot the house down. And they're like, well, I can't. He's like, well, I can't do that because they said not to blow up the buildings or whatever. And they're like, I'm telling you, it's literally right there. You got to do it. So anyway, it all gets screwed up because they didn't see where it was, and they all have to retreat. Anyway, the guy gets left behind, and it's weird because it was interesting. He meets this these two this Danish father and daughter, and kind of hides with them in this barn overnight, and he actually has to kill a German soldier with a bayonet that's really violent, and they see it and they're freaked out by it or whatever. But anyway, that you can tell that whole time it's really good, but you're like, oh, this guy will live through this whole thing because they're keep putting so much effort into his character. So that's all to say, it would be a little more interesting if it introduced characters and killed them off a little quicker. Maybe that would be more effective of a statement. Randomly, James McAvoy was in the episode last night, barely, and he died by the end of it. Yeah. And it was just kind of that was before he was a big actor. But but anyway, so that show is sort of like Saving Private Ryan, and then in that it is like, oh, these people are just together. The ultimate theme is about the brotherhood of the platoons. But at the same time, I feel like it is a little more historical than Saving Private Ryan, because it's like, look at
Has
actually...
more time to do
well,
that,
and it
too.
says, look at how actually important this specific company was to the war
and
effort.
it's a lot more specific about
Like,
specific territories and like battles and all that.
They paratrooped into Normandy. They paratrooped into that failed Holland operation. They went back into France. Then I think they were the group that infiltrated the Eagle's Nest in Germany. That was Hitler's like estate. They were actually the ones who went there. So it is kind of historical in saying there are these different. They actually were in all these places, kind of like the Big Red One, that movie that Samuel Fuller made, is similar sense. But so yeah, as much as can be said for something like that, which I think is, by the way, bar none, the best battle scenes ever filmed in anything, is like, particularly there's a couple, one or two, I think, or maybe one of them in particular might be literally the best battle scene in a movie or in a TV show I've ever seen. But as great as all that is like, is it exactly a historical product? It is, in the fact that it is about history, but it doesn't make particularly specific statements about it. So I guess that's kind of what we're saying about all this, to kind of move it along, is that historical films are a little bit different from war films, costume dramas, or period pieces. Because even a period piece like Carol is not making a statement about history. It is
Other
saying,
than, as we said, like perhaps about what queerness felt like in the 50s,
yes.
you know what I mean?
But it's not, but yes, other than that, it's not exactly a statement about history. Exactly. So,
and I feel like we can talk a little bit specifically about biopics, I think, because I feel like that's another one of the most recognizable forms of historical filmmaking on a wider level. We talked about this a little bit with, I think, with Jackie and JFK a little bit too. This whole notion of like cradle to the grave biopics is something that's went a little more and more by the wayside in recent years. 3 big movies again that are, I think, all great in their own way, but something like Jackie, Lincoln, or Selma, about Martin Luther King Jr., that there's now this trend in biopics, instead of doing from a beginning to end on that person, doing, a episode or a vignette of their life that is in some way illustrative of the rest of their lives. And we already talked about that a little bit in the past. But one that I really want to highlight, and I would go ahead and say I'd put this in the good to great category when we're talking about versions of this, is Malcolm X. That movie had an almost impossible task of adapting, that book, which is a brilliant book, the autobiography of Malcolm X, into a single feature-length film. And Spike Lee, who was coming off of, Do the Right Thing, Mo Better Blues. I mean, the degree of difficulty to make a movie like that and it be as great as it is arguably the achievement of his career. Denzel Washington, bar none, too, also playing Malcolm X. But then I think about really bad versions of biopics, too. I think about, like, Lee Daniels' The Butler, which is one of the most laughable films I've ever seen in my life.
Everything you are.
Everything you have. It's because that Butler. Because, like,
I haven't even seen that movie.
There's the very famous scene that me and some friends in college used to watch all the time and laugh about. We've watched plenty of times ourselves and laughed about, like, okay, so this movie is like literally the fast food version of history, specifically of the 60s. It's like that this butler, who was the butler of the White House, how he was like privy to and like secretly
Basically enacted
influential
policy is what
like
it's trying
by
to say.
being a good man. And there's a bunch of times where like there's literally a president in the Oval Office who's debating whether I should do this or that, and he'll like come in and like set down the stuff and be nice, say nothing at all about any of this stuff, doesn't know what's going on, and like walks away and leaves. I think I remember James Marsden playing JFK. I think I remember some scenes. And he like looked at him leaving, and he was like, and there's nothing said, but he's looking at him like look at that butler go, like look at that butler, and then like it immediately cuts to like JFK has decided to take a stand with King and civil rights. And it's just like that he had this huge like influence, and then his son, played by David Oyelowo, who later played Martin Luther King Jr. brilliantly, he's like this black radical, and that like they get into all these
butler, and they call him the butler in the movie.
in his own house.
Yeah,
in his own house. His wife and his son continue to call him the butler. It's like he has a name. He's not the It's just very bizarre.
If they had done Lee Daniels the butler trademarked, maybe that would have worked better.
There's not enough scenes in that movie of John Cusack as Richard Nixon because he plays Nixon in the movie.
You know what they should have done, though, is when you said, look at that butler go, it made me think of, what if they had a Jimmy Durante cut of the butler where he's like, instead of, look at that frosty go, it was, look at that butler go. But
that movie is so horrible. I've actually thought about us watching it before and then doing a podcast on it. We very remember, because it is
I haven't seen it
is a daggum Halloween mask, joke show of a, historical film. It is just so bad.
Right.
And especially, again, there are a lot of other bad versions of biopics. I know there's a lot of time where Ray and or Walk the Line kind of were seen as the whole music biopic is its whole other thing. And obviously,
Dewey Cox need to think about his whole life before he plays.
Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story, in many ways, is a perfect parody of a lot of music biopics and works hilariously on its own right.
Yeah.
But if you see some of those movies, you see specifically some things that it's going after. Like, Walk the Line is actually good.
Yeah.
But it's being directed by James Mangold, who's a good director, and Joaquin Phoenix, of course, brilliant actor. Reese Witherspoon's good. But there's, a few scenes in that movie that honestly make me laugh also, just there's a scene where he rips a sink off the wall, and then Walk Hard takes that to the extreme, and he does it several times.
Can I talk about that moment really quickly and be kind of genuine about that? I've never seen that movie, Walk the Line, but every time I hear about that, people joke and laugh about him ripping the sink off the wall. This is all going to be out of nowhere. I've always thought this. I've never even seen the image of him doing it. I've only heard about it.
Yeah.
But I've always imagined that in my mind as a really, actually pretty serious, dramatic.
Well, that's
event.
What it's
and
definitely supposed
I know
to be.
That's what. But I actually feel a sort of emotion towards that, having not even seen it, of a angry desperation of I will literally rip a sink off the wall. And it's funny, but it's weird. I've never felt that way about anything else, where I feel the emotion that it wants me to feel without having ever seen it happen. I'm sure if I actually saw it, I would laugh. But I've always thought that about that, though. But I want to just say that.
Something say Walk the Line or Ray, you've not seen either one of those movies, right? But do you automatically in your head have an idea of what those movies
I know
are?
what they are. Yeah.
And so, what does that say about that mode of filmmaking?
Well, it's pretty bankrupt. You have a lot of it's the same thing with these Rocket Man, Bohemian Rhapsody. I heard Rocket Man was actually kind of good compared to Bohemian Rhapsody, but frankly, there's a lot more edges and contours to a person like Elton John than there is to Freddie Mercury. It's almost like everything is better about that. But and also that they totally supposedly neglected, not totally, but mostly neglected the queerness of Freddie Mercury. And that was not the case with Rocket Man, because clearly Elton John the man himself had more to do with the movie, and therefore is going to
there's debate about that too, about even with Queen's involvement in
Bohemian
Rhapsody, what role should some of these people who are being depicted even have a role at all in their
And then it was directed by a gay man in Bryan Singer too. Mm-hmm. And it's just kind of that whole movie's a mess.
Yeah.
There's that one specific scene I remember that was that movie was known for best editing or whatever, and it was literally one of the worst edited things I've ever seen.
There's a scene, it's they're outside by a cafe area.
What's his name? Littlefinger that was in it.
Oh,
that guy that was on The Wire.
Yeah.
But anyway, I was about to say my little buddies told me, but no, it's no Littlefinger, not the little birdies.
Yeah.
But anyway. That there's some stuff in that just oh my god, this looks so bad.
Yeah.
And then even that moment where it was Rami Malek had been nominated for playing
who's
him.
a friend of the pod, as we know, on the very beginning of the pod.
I enjoy I'm a fan of equal rights for all. It's I am too, but I don't have to say it like a weirdo, like that. But anyway,
we didn't say enough back in the day about his No Time to Die performance, villain performance.
Weird, yeah. We'll talk about that some other day. But anyway, so when they were showing the Oscar reel for that, and it was it was like Freddie Mercury's voice over him singing.
No, so literally in the Best Actor clip they were showing, and this was literally the last Oscars I think I watched. So I think around that time I'm done with this. It's a whole phenomenon.
Right, I guess another one's coming up soon.
Oh well. He famously was in the same category as Bradley Cooper for *A Star Is Born*.
Yeah,
which
was him actually singing, right?
Well, not only that, but he sung at the Oscars with Lady Gaga, and which was a magical, beautiful performance of The Shallow.
Not to be confused with The Shallows
or Chalamet. But literally in his clip, he was lip syncing. It was clear,
and it cut to him, and he kind of was like, had this kind of look on his face, like, "Oh, they really did that, huh?" Like he thought it was.
But
stupid.
then, I don't even know if Cooper's clip was of him singing or if it was a dramatic scene or whatever. But he clearly was singing in the movie, and so it was just and they literally gave it to friggin' Malik, and so it's like, what the hell's the point of any of this? Like, why?
And what's so annoying about that moment that they chose was him singing parts of Bohemian Rhapsody for the first time, and he stopped short like it's a religious moment. Like, I have sung the song, which I'll make it clear if I haven't already. I hate Queen. I loathe them. I don't want anything to do with them. They are one of the most annoying pop cultural presences that exists.
And I say
all this to randomly say, I actually think Freddie Mercury was a pretty talented vocalist, but oh well.
Under pressure, all the best parts are, of course, from Freddie Mercury. Nothing to do with David Bowie or anything.
Well, recently, Brian May came out and said some real stupid stuff. I don't remember what it was about, and a bit complaining about something. And it's just that whole group, it seems like, is just really only cares about money, and they're just a pretty shrill.
But speaking of music biopics, we talked a little bit about this last week, a little bit with Todd Haynes, but his Bob Dylan film, I'm Not There, that's kind of a totally other approach to do a music biopic, of course, with Dylan, played by 5 or 6 different people. Wildly different people.
And strangely,
it works for Dylan, but I don't know how you
I don't even know that I think I would say that Velvet Goldmine would be a historical film, but I feel like it makes some very specific statements about a particular... Well, not even that, but even about the 80s as a historical time period. I feel like it's making very specific statements about that would lead me to maybe say it's possibly a historical film, more even than I'm Not There would be. But anyway. But so biopics very rarely are actually historical films, other than a movie like Vice, which I feel like actually is making some statements about the war on terror
and
that are
also
very specific, and even about the 60s and
Dick
70s.
Cheney, where his origin story, where he eventually goes as vice president, is all informed by a lot of stuff from the 70s and kind of the fallout from Watergate and this that whole time period. Now would be a good time for us, I guess, to talk about some good, middling, and even some outright bad examples. I, unfortunately, have been very busy this past week and did not have time to sit down and make some versions of this.
And I'll be honest, I kind of forgot to do stuff for the second part of what we're going to do here in a minute, but I have some ideas for that, here. But sort of.
So Levi, he's got a list of some, and I'm sure I'm going to agree or
we'll run through these kind of quickly, too. We don't have to spend forever talking about them, but the first one I listed was Titanic for good. Yeah, so we have good, middling, and bad. I'll go through the good first. There's way more of those.
What about Titanic to you as a good?
Well, I'll cede most of this to you because you've written about it, and the other movie of comparison is in my bad list. That it's about a very large historical event. Interestingly, our dad's grandfather was born in 1900. He died in the 1980s. He got in a car crash. But he lived over most of the century. It's always interesting to hear about people.
Yeah.
That was the case. Ernest Hemingway and Alfred Hitchcock were also versions of that, although Hemingway died earlier than either of these other two men we're talking about. But that we were just talking to our dad. I was just talking to my dad last night about the Titanic, the movie. We were just talking about it, and because we were laughing about that way. Thank you. Moment. And look at me, you filth. But anyway, and he was saying that his grandfather remembered hearing about that and seeing that in the newspapers when it happened.
Yeah, when it happened.
In 1912. Mm-hmm. But what's important about that is it follows a big historical event, which actually it kind of lost some omnipresence in the cultural currency sort of.
There had been some movies
A
made
Night
about
to Remember
Titanic,
had been made, and like there were certain things, but it kind of had been sort of pseudo lost to time in a certain way. And around that time, it was earlier that decade, they had found the Titanic under the water and kind of went to
I think that was partially what spurred Cameron James Cameron to conceive
with
of the
Titanic though, particularly that was a time when it was kind of becoming a thing again. Also, that it was at the end of the century, and that was so early in the century. But that movie is about a very big historical event. But it is also explicitly about, and obviously the characters in that movie did not make choices that led to the sinking of the Titanic. So that's clear. They didn't cause the Titanic to sink. But they made choices in history that affected themselves, and they were affected by history in itself.
Well, there were one of the designers of the ship was one of the guys who encouraged the captain to go full speed and
contribute to why it happened. Like the main two characters.
Right, yeah.
No, there were people in the movie who made decisions to do that, right? But to cause it.
Well, also with the divide between Jack and Rose, you have a pretty distinct division of class, which is about that time period. Of course, Rose DeWitt is a woman of privilege. A woman, she's 17 years old. I mean, she's like, and Jack is, of course, this kind of impoverished, I would say layabout, but he's not a lazy guy. He's from Wisconsin, and he's just traveled all across a lot of America, but then he made his way into Europe at some point in the early teens, been to Paris, and then finds himself in kind of. I don't know if they sailed from Britain or Ireland.
They did.
The ship was made in Ireland. I think
they sailed from Britain. Right. It was. I feel really stupid now. I'm gonna have to look it up.
But so there's a clear division of class in that movie, and in what was in the reality too. And that relationship is a chance to kind of spend more time with that.
Sauthampton.
Yeah.
Which is in Liverpool.
Okay.
So
because on the very back of the ship, I remember when it's sinking, it says RMS Titanic Liverpool, it says on the very back. So, the lads from Liverpool. It's a movie that I really love. I'd say it's like probably my top 50 favorite movies, actually, which I'd say is pretty high. And I normally don't show it in school because I don't have the time to.
Yeah.
But I actually did recently with my third and fourth periods because there were some test days, the pre-ACT, and so I had some time with some kids that I didn't with others, and so I actually showed Titanic to two of my classes, and some of the kids had seen it, some hadn't, and I've never taught it before. It is just like a treasure trove of like teaching the Gilded Age before the wake of the First World War. I mean, it's just like got so many things you can talk about. And I mean, like, it talks about how, like, Cal, played by Billy Zane's character, is like, he's like a Pittsburgh steel magnate. And it was a chance for me to go, all right, who else is a Pittsburgh steel magnate? And they're like, Carnegie. And so, like, there's a lot of history in that movie. And what I really love about the movie, too, is the MacGuffin of the movie is the heart of the ocean. It's this historical artifact. We have to find this historical artifact. And in doing so, in literally diving underwater and trying to find this thing, we actually find, wait a minute, who are the actual people who had this historical artifact that we've been forgotten about or don't care about anymore?
And that is in itself saying that the artifacts of history, we focus so much on the thing when it's actually the people around it who was what was important about it. Yeah, that is the case with every single historical artifact you would ever find because it had to have been made by a human being, first of all, and that it had to have been possessed by human beings. So that is the way that those things work. It's like, quickly to talk about this, there was when we went to Jamestown, I don't remember who it was, but it was a body that they had exhumed of someone that lived there. And it was literally a skeleton that was like from the 1600s. Yeah. And I remember I stood there and just looked at it for a good 10 minutes probably. I kept kind of looking and staring at it. I was like, that is a representation of not even a representation. That was a person that was alive that long ago.
Mm-hmm.
And that was that old. And I stood there and looked at that way longer than anything else because I was like, this is an actual human being, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, you know, usually we're that way all the time about, this bullet that was found at Gettysburg, and it's like, well, it went through somebody, you know, I mean, so, or it was fired by somebody, or, you know, that's the whole point of the whole thing. And yeah, that's what's important about that movie, is that it is very much getting at, it's making a historical statement about the way we look at history and how we look at it wrong, pretty much.
Yeah, and you know, the ending, very famously, is a very beautiful moment of the Rose had it the whole time, and for her, the heart of the ocean was always this representation of Jack. And that by kind of regaling her time and romance with Jack at the very end when she lets go of it is her finally making peace with this life that she did not get to live with him. And again, it's a very beautiful movie. I'm weirdly nostalgic for it now because, again, I grew up I remember when it came out, and
Yeah.
I was 97 it came out, I think? 98? 97, I think.
97, yeah.
And I would have been 5 years old, and so I didn't see it in the theater. I saw it in VHS. We saw it in the theaters in 2012, and it was re-released in 3D, and that was really cool.
Yeah, that's been almost 10 years ago. It's hard to believe.
And I just remember that thing just took over the culture. I mean, I really don't remember a movie being that impactful since I've been alive. Ever since then, a movie that just literally grabbed a hold of the culture as a kid.
It was
just
the highest grossing movie.
There's another thing too, is that like quote intellectual property. I mean, like, it's based on something that happened and people had some vague familiarity with, but now that is the primary source for a lot of people, is that film. You know what I mean? So, and
that's what popular history is and kind of should be in certain way. I mean,
I think that's the ideal of what popular history can be.
Yes,
is something like that, in terms of about the best version of that type of historical melodrama is Titanic, is the pinnacle. But again, in many ways, it's like, it's in the same tradition as a movie like Ben-Hur, or like certain biblical epics that were huge in the 50s and 60s. And again, that's very likely the last movie like that may ever be made, in terms of like that kind of big historical epic that was made for that amount of money and then was that wildly popular. You know?
Because Pearl Harbor tried to be that, but we'll get to that movie here in a little bit. Don't worry.
All right, so love Titanic. We will very likely actually do that movie again, or actually do that movie someday, and we can talk more about that.
So Heaven's Gate was my next one.
We've talked about that a few times on here.
We've actually talked about Heaven's Gate a random amount.
It's a great movie, though.
Yeah. I think what I love about that movie, we talk about this quite a bit. That movie is a Western. So in itself, it is, falls under certain Western tropes and what we talked about. And it recreates life of the period on a scale of extravagance that proved to actually be deadly towards a lot of horses in particular. But the movie is so big that it goes, though, beyond just being alive in that time period into being something about, a lot of different things. You go in different directions. One we've talked about is the promise of youth in America by all these, Ivy League schools, and then how that's destroyed by its own self, in that kind of nativist Americanism, and nativism in the sense of that time period, not like Native Americans, obviously.
Yeah, right.
But the nativist sentiments of the WASPs, basically, in America, and how that they basically destroy themselves.
Yeah.
But the thing I always talk about, that movie's really long. It's like, isn't it over 4 hours? Or is it just short of it?
I'm gonna look it up.
That the movie's really long, but we talk about this a lot, that the whole movie's amazing to watch through. There's not very many moments where I'm bored by that. Every time you look this up, by the way, you find it's always the Heaven's Gate cult that comes up, and I'm like, I don't want to hear about that. How long is it?
219 minutes.
I'll have to do
see alternative versions.
Yeah, it's like
Digital
3.5.
restored director's cut 216. Yeah.
So it's almost 4 hours.
Yeah.
But so, anyways,
The work print cut was 325 minutes.
Yeah.
But that most work prints are not the finished films anyways.
But that movie is so long, and none of it's really boring, but it's like it goes on and on, and and the whole movie ultimately is basically a sort of pseudo telling of the Johnson County War, which was basically between these immigrants that moved into these western areas and the kind of literally the U.S. cavalry kind of working to expel the people from where they wanted to be, or to get them out or move them around where they wanted them. And that the whole movie is this kind of slow back and forth between these kind of government agents and the immigrants that live there. And that finally it gets to this boiling point where they literally have had enough, and this literal battle happens at the end of the movie, which is so big and massive. And that what is so effective about a movie like that is it's not only about history, but it a lot of battle scenes in movies, they get this sort of like remove from itself, and it feels very like, oh, it's all very sterile, and the troops move this way, and they do this. I've never seen a battle scene that feels so personal and angry on both sides of that. Both of the sides are like, see the other person as the devil, literally.
And again, I think you can only achieve that with the length of the movie, because you've spent so much time with all of these people on both sides that it is just so personal. And like you said, it boils over into that climactic battle.
And that you feel angry while you're watching it. You feel this emotion. And it's strange because, of course, it's weird to watch a battle like that at a climax of a movie and you feel the rush of it. That's a kind of weird sensation that we should poke more holes into. But it is a reality that is something that you feel when you watch these things. But it's like I've said before, it's almost like watching Scarface, which is a far less good movie and has far
the 80s,
the 80s version. In that movie, what's so effective about the ending of that movie and why it's so iconic is that you spend 3 hours being pissed off at this individual. Well, at least I do.
Yeah.
And that you watch it and you're just like, I hate this person.
Yeah.
I cannot stand them. And then you finally get the ending, and it's like him fighting against literally the world at this point.
I mean, the world is not his.
Right. Yeah. And that you feel the enormity of the climax, that it feels earned, and you only feel that when you sit there and watch the whole thing. Kind of the same thing with Heaven's Gate, although you don't feel like you've wasted your whole time watching the movie, but like you do with Scarface, at least I do. But that when you get to the end of that, it is like a true feeling, and it's very rare for movies to actually carry such an emotion of that, I think. And literally, I mean, we've talked about the moments of John Hurt's whole placement in the movie, that he's this really, like, goofy, stupid, kind of smart, but, like, wastes his talent kind of person. He has that real dumb speech that he gives after the Reverend Doctor,
by Joseph Cotton,
at the beginning of the movie, that makes no sense. And it's like, over the movie, he kind of comes in and out, and then he literally dies in that battle, standing there. He's literally standing in the middle, and there's all these horses riding around and people getting shot, and there's all this screaming. It's just all this awful stuff. It's a very cacophonous battle, and that he's just standing there drinking and just watching it all happen. And he says, God, I miss Paris. And I think that's one of the just best random moments in a movie for a character who isn't that big of a deal, but he kind of represents the soul of the movie, of that he represents this whole promise of youth just totally tarnished by not only literal drunkenness in that sense, but just drunkenness of soul. And that he's just a totally soulless human being who probably doesn't even really agree necessarily with anything that's happening. Exactly.
But doesn't have any sort of moral backbone to stand up and do anything.
But he doesn't really care either. And he dies in that moment, and he's just one more body in the midst of all these other people. But and then also, aside from that, you have literally these people who are watching, who is being, and that's another thing that's so personal about it, is that the people know who these families are that they want gone, to the point where they're literally sitting, marking the names off as they shoot them dead in the battle, which seems very, like, over the top, kind of, but, like, it's such a... It's just an image. It doesn't make it doesn't say anything. Nobody says anything visually, but it's one of the most randomly perceptive statements of in any movie I've ever seen. So a lot of that's just to praise a random portion of a movie that's very long, but like that's the whole point of the movie. And in that sense, it isn't only about history, but it actually makes you feel it in a way that no other movie I've ever seen has ever done, I don't think.
And again, I think the sheer force of will of the runtime is something that has that effect on you. And again, one thing that we've talked about probably on this podcast before, I know we talked about, is the use of the Blue Danube Waltz at the very beginning of the movie, of when they're, that Harvard commencement and they're all getting ready to go off and make these big successes of themselves. And you hear the Blue Danube Waltz, and again, it's people who love 2001.
Yeah.
When you use that music, you are putting yourself in comparison and in league with that film. And instantly, just first time I saw that movie, I kind of crossed my arms in my head and was like, how dare you use that music,
Yeah.
But then at the very, the ending of the climax of that battle, it very softly reprises that. And it's something that kind of hits you all of a sudden. You're like, oh, wow, like some of those same very characters who were there for that are now here for this. And just the passage of time, the sheer passage of not only our time, of course, over 3 hours, but even you feel that 20-year period of the difference between where they were there and where they were now.
Yeah.
Something about that movie I think a lot about is the very, very ending, where it jumps ahead like 1903, I think. I was looking about a decade after the resolution
Because I think it was like 1890 was the most of the movie. Yeah.
1870 was the very beginning. 1890 is what most of the movie is, and then the very end, like an epilogue's in 1903. And you see an older Christopherson in that section. He's abandoned the working class look that he had a little bit. Well, it's weird. He's like this Western, like, easy-going sheriff in kind of Wyoming, was it? Or Montana? Yes. Was Wyoming, I think it was. But he's still wearing these nice
like a U.S.
suits.
Marshal.
Yeah, U.S. Marshal.
Yeah.
But he's kind of abandoned that, and here he is. He's returned to that sense of class that he had in the very beginning of the movie. And he's even with the same woman, older. It was the girlfriend that he had at the very beginning. And so it's like, it all, quote, worked out for him. He got the nice boat. He's rich now.
Like
he's with that same woman. Yeah. So then you go, what was all that about?
And it was like 30 years of his life.
It's like there were 30 years of his life that was just like, quote, wasted. And it's like the romance he had with
Isabelle
Huppert, and the intensity of all that, and it's like, that's all gone.
And even the kind of love-hate relationship he had with Christopher Walken. I must say Christoph Waltz. Christopher Walken in the movie. And all these relationships he had, and literally he's the only one out of that whole group of people that's alive. Like everybody else,
and that he always had the option to just return to that,
right?
And then the movie he has, and again, if you look at objectively, he won the day. He's rich. He's got his girlfriend he had at Harvard. It all, effed it all up. And it all worked out, but it's like you have this sense of melancholy. It's just like, that whole other world he's from is gone. It's disappeared. It doesn't exist anymore. And that sense of loss that you feel for him, and that that's a pain that only he and us understand. Right. We as the audience understand that, and he as the character understand that. And so that's the thing I think about a lot with that movie, is just the powerfulness of that ending of he turned the page and he went back to being who he was, but then all those other lives were either literally lost or just lost to time, and that he could always have that option of going back, and he did. And so that in and of itself I find to be a very powerful historical idea. In its own way, I don't think it's making very, very explicit comparisons to this, but in its own way, a representation of a version of Theodore Roosevelt, a man who came from privilege in the late 19th century, intentionally tried to go west to harden his image, and then came back as this cowboy figure who eventually became president. It's not explicitly about Theodore Roosevelt, but that is a archetypal figure of that time period, that there are certain comparisons can be made between him and that. So, both great long movies.
Yes.
Make good double features, maybe.
Next one is Reds.
Oh, boy.
After these, we're going to jump through these. I'll just go ahead and say after these, I want to jump through these a little quicker, but yeah.
I mean, literally, as we sit here, I'm staring at a framed Reds lobby card I have Warren Beatty is my all-time favorite actor. He is Bay. Hashtag
I
Beatty
mean,
Bays.
Beatty. Yeah.
I only saw it for the second time relatively recently. We both just got the new Blu-rays that Paramount put out, and we're going to be trying to watch them soonish. You go first on this, because I have a lot of thoughts on it.
Yeah, you're going to have more to say about it than me. I think more than anything, what it represents is it is a biopic about John Reed, or Jack Reed, as they call him in the movie, but his name is John Reed. But that what's important about that, I think, and I'll just focus squarely on the witnesses in the movie, that they're people who knew John Reed and
or were familiar with that socialist movement in the turn of the century. Yeah.
Oh Lord, what's her name?
Diane Keaton's
Diane Keaton's character. Her name's on the tip of my tongue. Anyways, people that knew them or who were part of kind of that era of socialism.
Louise Bryant.
Yeah. That they're kind of just talking about what it was like to live then, what it was like to be part of those movements. Randomly, one of them is Henry Miller, the
Tropic of Cancer.
The Tropic of Cancer, and all those Nexus, Plexus, and Sextus, or whatever all those books are. I mean, there's literally the names of them, I think. But one of the most profane writers in American
letters.
I mean, and he literally says the F word in part of the you know what he's talking about people were always blanking back then. We just didn't talk about it or whatever. But that I think that's so important, because to take people who were part of, because we look at, and that's part of the whole movie, was that John Reed wrote the book 10 Days That Shook the World about the Bolshevik Revolution. And he was there when it happened, and kind of writing about what that was like and how that felt for communists and socialists and anarchists at the time to see that happen in a country as big as Russia. And that the movie is almost, kind of, I don't know so much a celebration, but just a recognition of the American
contribution
leftists that existed before that, and a contribution sort of, but even just a recognition that they existed, because we were talking earlier about this just in general, as we do about history, that communism existed far before that, like the 1850s, like 60s, when Karl Marx and Frederick Engels kind of created it in its own way. Versions of it had been the case before that, I guess, but that it really took until the 19-teens for it to actually take over in a big way in a major country. Later on,
and it should be said, it made sense it would be Russia when you think back about it, because Russia was the most devastated by the Great War. Things were so awful that they said, we're going to try something
and
different.
Even that in China a few years later, that there would a civil war would start there that wouldn't end for another over 25 years, but that in these larger countries these things were happening, but that I think the movie is important in not only exclusively in this, but kind of the way I guess I choose to approach it is important in just recognizing that there were people in America other even than Eugene Debs who champion these leftist ideas, and that kind of have been forgotten in their own way in the global scope of communism and socialism. But anyway.
And another thing is too about Reds the film is that and Heaven's Gate kind of both coming out when they did in 80 and 81 were the last gasps of the new Hollywood, and ultimately kind of the final bosses or final levels of new Hollywood of making movies of that scale that they actually were able to get released, because Reds was basically broke even, and so that was not nearly the disastrous financial thing that Heaven's Gate was, but was still a big deal. And I think specifically for Reds to come out just as Ronald Reagan was elected president, and there's a huge conservative swing in America in general at that time. For Beatty, again, he had been working on that movie forever. There was a whole host of screenwriters who came in and done drafts on the movie. I think Elaine May actually kind of came in towards the end and helped do some final rewrites and help edit the movie as well. But that there was one of the screenwriters, I can't remember. I remember reading this in one of the Beatty biographies, the Biskin one, that he needed to go do some research on John Reed after having been approached by Beatty. So I can't remember if it was in L.A. or the New York public libraries, he went and got all these books on John Reed. And, that's back in the days where they literally would write who had the books and stamp it and all that. That literally routinely 5-6 times in some of these books, Warren Beatty's name had already checked out some of these books. So this was a huge passion project for him for years and years and years. Going back as early as, I think, the late 60s, I think he was already thinking about trying to do that. And that he pushed all his chips in the table to have that movie get made. And then literally didn't appear in the movie until Ishtar, like 6 years later after that. So that was the level of investment he had in the
and it
project.
made money, and it was successful.
And he won Best Director for it.
I mean, yeah.
And I think he's only the second person to be nominated after Orson Welles for actor, director, picture, screenplay, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's the only other person. Him and Orson Welles are the only people to ever have the distinction of being nominated for that stuff. So, again, as a huge fan of Beatty. I think that's his most important work in a variety of ways. I mean, something like Bonnie and Clyde will always be very, very important because of what it meant to the culture. But in terms of him taking on a more active role behind the camera, Reds is always going to be that thing. And again, I think he gets away with the movie being about as radical as it is because of the love story between Bryant and Reed in the movie, him and Diane Keaton. That I think there's a lot of people who probably would be turned off by the politics or the movie. Yeah. But that is enough of a thing for people to go, okay, I'll get into that if nothing else.
Yeah.
And just as a depiction of Reed, who I need to know more about, but know a decent amount, a little bit about, I guess. A fearlessness that journalists today all too often don't really quite possess.
The first image of him in the movie is running after that. I guess he's in Mexico when the Mexican Revolution was going on. He's like running after that carriage, and there's lots of gunfire going on. It's like even in the moment you have on the lobby card there of him doing a similar kind of moment of running after a wagon or whatever. But he was clearly a dedicated man. And he died in Moscow too.
He was buried in the Kremlin.
And
he's only American to have that distinction, you know. And I think another thing too is, specifically like leftists on the internet or leftists on Twitter or whatever you want to call it, a very annoying breed.
Yeah.
I say this is someone of liberal and progressive values.
We say this as leftists, relatively.
But that it's so easy to put on a hat and put on a pose of, I'm a leftist or I'm a communist, whatever. Back then, you were walking the walk if you actually threw yourself out there to be that. And I'm not even saying necessarily I agree with communism. We've talked about this a little bit in the past with JFK.
Yeah.
But you're a person of your own integrity if you really put yourself out there as that kind of thing.
Eugene Debs ran for president from jail.
Yeah.
That's a dedication to your...
I think he got as much as, I tell this to the kids, like in 1912, which was the crazy election where you had Roosevelt, Wilson, and Taft.
Yeah.
He got 5% of the vote. 5% of the vote. That seems very, very small, but you think there's enough people in the country to get
how
behind
many people who are that angry.
And that was kind of the highlight. Yeah. That was the biggest that would ever get,
again,
I think.
Right.
But and also you have multiple people running, and so it's easy to water down the votes and all that. But
that's a very big portion of the country, though.
Yeah.
To be outwardly at that time saying, I want to vote for a socialist.
And let me say this too, the movie also obviously depicts Eugene O'Neill, played brilliantly by the brilliant Jack Nicholson.
And Emma Goldman also is in the movie, I think. I think that's one of the only other things it won in the movie was the actress that played Emma Goldman won.
But I've since read some plays by Eugene O'Neill, which I've quite loved. Let's see. Long Day's Journey into Night, and then Iceman Cometh. Both brilliant plays. And specifically the Iceman Cometh, actually it's set in the teens.
Yeah.
Deals with characters who themselves are disillusioned anarchists / socialists.
Yeah.
And so clearly when he was writing those later on in the 30s and 40s, he's having to think about this time period. And he himself obviously functioned as a character who interacted with some of these people. And that was the period. There's several 80s movies like that. In terms of endearment or even broadcast news, where Jack Nicholson just kind of pops into some movies. Now, in terms of endearment, I'd say he has a pretty sizable part in that. and he won an Academy Award for that.
Yeah, that's what's funny about that movie, though, is it's in Reds that he's like, his whole place in the movie is like, instead of like, I am tired and I am dirty, it's like, I am in love and I am mad. Like, you know, that his whole character in that movie is literally like, literally, I am in love with you and I am angry about it, or like, I am angry that you don't love me or whatever. And then that Beatty's Reed is just like, well, whatever about everything.
Yeah,
It's
he's
just
so
like,
all over the place.
right,
Yeah,
and it's interesting.
Deeply love Reds. Deeply recommend you watch. It's on HBO Max. You can stream it that way, or get the new Blu-ray.
Yeah. And before we move on, never forget the amazing line reading of "What do you do? I write. You wrong."
Yeah,
that cop hits him like with a gun or whatever.
One last thing I want to mention real quick before we move on from it is, I remember this hit me the first time I watched the movie, and then I kind of forgot, and then the second time I watched the movie, and I think it's like almost inherently built into this final statement in the movie is over the credits, and you're hearing some last witness voiceover, you know.
Yeah.
I don't remember who says this. I can't remember who says it, but something along the lines of like how deeply American John Reed is as a person and as a presence. And that while he thought communism was a replacement or an answer to capitalism run amok, deep down it all came from a love of this country that he had, that he wanted to see those changes happen. And I don't think there's one time I watched the movie before that where I really even questioned that. But to end on that note where it is kind of saying that John Reed was, above all else, an American who wanted to see America succeed. Sure, it may have been through a different method than America's used to, but it is deeply rooted out of a love of America. In many ways, is a great final statement to end the movie on, to say, hey, you know what? Actually, there are other forms of patriotism or Americanism that are not as obvious to some people, but in many ways Reed himself was an embodiment of. So, check out Reds on HBO Max or the Blu-ray if you have the chance. Brilliant movie.
And we'll try to run through these a little quicker. Gangs of New York.
That's good. I mean, that's, Scorsese. That's all about really the draft rights.
Right.
You know, in
that's
the
part of what I love
mid-1860s.
about that, and I saw that pretty recently, but other than the flutes in the movie, which I totally love, is that it's positioning itself, it's kind of like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where it's like, it is very much about these nativist sentiments that led to the anger and that led to the draft rights, because they're saying, well, why are we being forced to do this, and blah blah blah. But also that in the midst of all that is this very American battle between ethnicity,
and something that here in the South, it's more of a race, black and white thing. But I know that in the North, ethnicity plays a larger role than it does here, and it's kind of also, it talks a little bit about conscription in the midst of the Civil War, which is something that is not as frankly talked about topic as maybe it should be.
Right.
But, it's a good movie.
Lincoln.
Love Lincoln. We'll probably likely do that movie on this podcast someday. That's another movie that I like to show to the kids. I didn't get a chance to do it this time. But what's interesting is that whole section of the passage of the 13th Amendment in Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals, is actually only lasts for a few pages.
Yeah.
But it blows it up into kind of a central idea in the late first term of, basically the only term of Lincoln. And again, that just, to me, is like almost a comfort film. It just checks all these boxes of things I want to see in historical films. Directed by Steven Spielberg, Daniel Day-Lewis as Abraham Lincoln. And I remember going into all the expectations of what that was supposed to be, and it somehow went above and beyond. Mm-hmm. Brilliant movie. Love that.
Yeah.
What are some thoughts you have about Lincoln?
Just that what I love about it is that it's kind of everything you want in a historical movie. It's got the big cast. It's about Abraham Lincoln, but it is also about only one of his accomplishments, and that it's more zeroed in on that. Also being about Thaddeus Stevens, and some other
and also about the Copperheads, in the North,
and about a lot of other things that kind of get unspokenly mentioned when you talk about that.
And also the whole idea that they had to break a few rules to actually get the 13th Amendment passed. I mean,
The New World.
So again, Terrence Malick did that. We love that movie. I'd say it's similar to The Thin Red Line in the sense of like it's using this historical thing to let Terrence Malick do Terrence Malick, which is by no means a slight because those are two of the greatest films ever made. Yeah. That kind of has obviously been positioned as Jamestown, the true story, and in and of itself takes a leap or two and mythologizes a thing or two. Yeah. But is some of Malick's best moments as a filmmaker, I think, are in that film.
And I think the main reason I mentioned it was just because I know Pocahontas has
a banger soundtrack, by the way.
A cultural cachet that movie tried to, I don't even think he cared, but in certain ways sort of rectified. I don't know. But
great movie.
Aguirre, The Wrath of God. The reason I picked this one, I guess, was because it is a very opaque movie that is, like these other movies, using, the Age of Exploration to kind of explore, ideas about nature and humanity and existentialism, but is also, I think, actually really about that time period of exploration in its own way.
And in many ways of like, be careful what you wish for in terms of these colonizers coming into the jungle and the terrors that await them basically for that. And the resentment that they feel towards the indigenous people for that very reason, the idiocy of that.
Cabaret.
That's really good. Obviously, that's, Bob Fosse, 1972, about kind of pre-war Germany and the kind of subtle rise of fascism Republic, and the decline of the Weimar Republic and Nazism kind of becoming the big de facto political philosophy of Germany and kind of that interwar period. And to juxtapose that as a musical was an interesting
and I think
concept.
That's part of the point why I wanted to mention that too is that whole movie, it's like the cabaret performances themselves start as this very just like kind of innocent, it's just cabaret, it's musical theater. And then they slowly over time tinge into these more racist, fascist kind of platforms in its own way. But that even without that the cabaret represents to me this kind of like ignorance of actual happenings and events that are going on, and kind of a way an ostrich sticking its head in the sand of like the things that are happening around you. And of course that movie has one of the most shocking and impactful final images of any movie I've ever seen, of like the Nazis sitting watching the cabaret, and it's like the reflection on the
which in many ways is like a reprise of the opening, or just reminiscent of that, but it's a different thing.
Gettysburg we kind of already talked about.
We relatively recently saw that, and again the battle scenes in that are extraordinary, but also again, do you think that movie plays into like lost cause narratives?
I don't really think
extent?
so.
I mean, it's been
maybe,
accused of that,
maybe
but I don't
partially, but I don't think as much as some people do think so. It did actually talk about slavery more than I was expecting in like one or two scenes, but like, hey, that's more than
a lot of
movies felt was required. Actually, it was far more required. But no, I don't really think. I mean, it lionizes the Lee and the Tom Berenger character. I can't remember. Longstreet, I think. But I don't think it does it to the extent that people say it does. But I mean, it does a little bit. Yeah. But
that's a really pretty great movie. Yeah.
There's a lot of random movies here. I might skip over some. Meek's Cut Off.
Well, that's like obviously a kind of an anti-Western almost. Kelly Reichardt's Western.
Yeah.
How does that to you contribute to the cinema of Kelly Reichardt and as a genre affair?
Well,
and she's made a few genre movies now, a little bit more so like that, and
First Cow.
Well, also
Night Moves.
Night Moves. Yeah. I was thinking.
Well, I'm even saying. I guess I'm thinking more of these like period piece movies that she's made, like First Cow, Meek's Cut Off. I think what that gets at is it's kind of an like Night Moves. It's kind of an anticlimactic type of genre movie. But I think what's important about that is kind of the experience of and kind of the idea of the Oregon Trail, and kind of the pioneers. And what I really love about that movie is it's the Native American guide that they pick up along the way in the movie kind of helps them. Well, it's kind of a question of what he's actually doing and like, you know, of whether he's leading them anywhere or not. And the final image of the movie is him like just walking across this field, taking them where they're supposed to be going towards water somewhere. Yeah. And the whole idea is like of the kind of interplay, I guess, between the Native American and the white man and what that means in this very basic sense of, oh, we really need this guy now, and then like whether or not he's going to lead them to any resolution is kind of, I think, a really interesting cliffhanger to end the movie on, but which I guess isn't exactly
a very Rockhardian take on the Western.
It's not exactly,
obviously.
I guess, a very specific kind of historical statement, but I think it is in a certain way. Meet Me in St. Louis. The reason I wanted to mention this, I guess, is because I think it's just interesting to me. The whole idea of the World's Fair is just kind of an antiquated belief now, but in that movie it's very much tied around the idea of we will move to a city just because that will happen there. Yeah. And like that sounds funny. I mean, we laugh at it, but that's literally what people did back then. I mean, in the novel Look Homeward Angel, which I never finished, but a whole portion of that book, at least what I read, was about that family moving to St. Louis for that same World's Fair, and kind of the idea that people would do that. You know, just to be like, oh, well, let's go over here. And then what that means to the family unit. It's also interesting that the movie positions them as kind of a somewhat destitute family. Yeah. Sort of. And it's like they live in a really nice house and they have the ability to say, let's move to St. Louis to go to a World's Fair. And it's kind of makes you laugh. It's like, this is what, and that wasn't even what being destitute was at that time, because it really wasn't. I mean, people really, if they were really poor then. I mean, you know, people are really poor now, but I feel like poverty then was like, I mean, the depths of poverty was so intense.
Well, it's one of those classic things. There's a lot of movies about, or stories or novels too, about privileged people, and they consider themselves, quote, the poorer privileged people, and even still, there's like, they're objectively, class-wise, they're towards the top, but they see themselves as lower.
So I guess the reason I mention that is because it's kind of making statements that are in itself that are funny, I think, to think about. The Magnificent Ambersons.
Orson Welles' follow-up to Citizen Kane, famously.
That movie is about a family, but it very much makes a point of being like Joseph Cotton, the Reverend Doctor, being like, back then we had cars were a new thing or whatever, and it's like very like, this is the way things were. And it's interesting that the movie is like half of itself too, sort of, because
trip down memory lane.
Yeah, I mean, literally delve into the layers of Winnipeg. I mean, but yeah, there's just an interesting movie because it was only part of itself. It was supposed to be longer and even bigger than Citizen Kane. It had this kind of big idea of what it wanted to be, but that it's still interesting, I think, as a historical document, is seeing this kind of life of this family kind of adapt to new changes in society. And so it's an all right movie, but I think
famously, there was a longer cut of the movie that Wells considered, and some who had saw it considered it to be even better than Citizen Kane, that has since been lost, and people always wonder, are they going to find the cut of it? And it's yet to turn up. I think what is there is pretty good, but I honestly haven't thought a lot about it. I've thought it much more so than other Orson Welles movies that are not Citizen Kane, but are still wildly memorable in my mind. But
The Remains of the Day,
that's really great. Obviously, that's James Ivory. You're more familiar with than I am.
Yeah, I'm quite
those Merchant Ivory movies. That's a really great depiction of kind of appeasement culture in Britain around the time right before the Second World War. And Anthony Hopkins, of course, playing a butler in that film. Not the butler. He's not Lee Daniels the butler, but he's
right.
And that is such a heartbreaking love story.
Yeah,
that doesn't have any sex scenes, or doesn't have, but what feels like a sex scene is like these two characters almost touching each other. It feels like the intensity of like the relationship.
That scene in the movie where he's sitting there reading a romance novel, and he finds that embarrassing, and she's like keeps wanting to see it, and he's like up against the wall, and she's like right at him, and it feels like, oh my god, this is the love scene of the movie, and it's not. But it's like you said, the intensity of that is very. that's a movie I think all the time about. But part of that, I think, is that idea that how this man literally was in the house of an appeasement approving Nazi sympathizer in Britain.
Yeah.
And the whole question of the movie to people is it's all about regret, the whole movie. And his father died and he didn't care. His master was like a Nazi and he didn't care. He kind of wanted to have this relationship with this woman that worked there of the Emma Thompson role and didn't really care. And the whole movie he's being kind of questioned by certain people about, but didn't you live in the house where that Nazi lived? And he's like,
it's kind of after the fact.
And he's like, I never knew anything about that. And it's like the opposite of the butler, where it's like he's like going in these rooms and seeing these things happen, but will have no say. He's like, I know nothing of that. I don't want anything to do with that. And questioning about like, what does that say about you, though, that you stood by and let these things happen and didn't say anything or kept working for them. And that also, though, it's about wanting to recapture that love that he had for this woman that he didn't even really maybe even know that he had. And that all that cannot be. And it truly is one of the most profound, saddest movies I've ever seen of about a person who is trapped in his life.
The very end of the movie was that there's like a bird trapped in the house and he's trying to get the bird out. One of the most interesting endings to any movie. I kind of wrote about this when I wrote about the movie on Letterboxd, is that the last moment, it's the last moment of variety in his life is a bird getting into the room. Yeah.
And he's like, I have to get this bird out of this room. And Christopher Reeve is there, a random Christopher Reeve performance in the movie too. But that he's like, oh yeah, okay, we'll deal with it or whatever. And there's this great shot of the bird flying away.
Yeah.
And he's like looking at it, and it's like almost he in the moment is realizing this is the last interesting moment in my life. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's just one of the saddest. And that's the end of the movie. That is the end of the movie.
That's essentially the end of this man's story.
And it's then the shot goes back away from the house, almost like it is the bird leaving. And I just think that's one of the most profound moments in any movie I've ever seen. And that it is about history, but it's also about this one man who was there and saw it all and did nothing, and and nobody will remember him, and he meant nothing.
Yeah, yeah.
So. We'll run through a few more real quickly here. We kind of talked about some of these. They shoot horses, don't they?
Yeah, that's a really good depiction of kind of 30s dance hall culture.
Yeah.
Which I didn't know was a thing, but it's like these marathon dances and people nearly killing themselves to... and that has a very early revelatory performance from Jane Fonda in it. Yeah. She's really great in the movie.
Walker.
Alex Cox.
Yeah.
Alex Cox history lesson.
Yeah.
Or Alex Cox history lesson.
Yeah, right.
So Sid and Bill's history lesson.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's about what's his name? What's his official full name?
William
Walker.
William Walker, yeah.
And like a lot of Cox
it's funny,
films,
I forgot his last name and we literally had just said it.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
But like kind of most of it is like set in this Western atmosphere, but then all of a sudden there are like very modern elements that
in like South America,
creep into the movie.
Nicaragua.
How does that fit into Alex Cox's filmography for you?
I quite love Alex Cox. I think what's so fascinating about that movie is that he made like movies like Repo Man and which is a real crazy punk movie, and then like Sid and Nancy, which is like a biopic about sort of pseudo punk royalty. Mm-hmm. And then even a movie like Highway to Hell. What's that called? Straight to Hell.
Yeah.
I had trouble remembering it. There is a movie called Highway to Hell, but had Ben Stiller in it, I think. But anyway, that Straight to Hell is just this real crazy neo-western about these like caffeinated coffee addicted psychopaths that live in this, and it's like Jim Jarmusch is this like hitman in the movie, and like it's a really ridiculous movie. But anyway, Walker though, I think is his most interesting movie because it's basically its thesis is comparing William Walker, and kind of because you remember one of my favorite random performances in any movie is Peter Boyle as Cornelius Vanderbilt.
Oh my God.
He's like, "I'll do what I want," and like farts, and like there's that scene where he literally takes a vase and pours water on his head just because he wants to, I guess.
Yeah.
But that it's comparing that whole era of American imperialism to the like CIA, secret wars, I guess, or covert wars in the 80s in Nicaragua, and kind of
Latin America,
literally like drawing a comparison between that and Reagan America, I think is one of the most interesting comparisons ever made in a movie. And it's like a total farce, and then the movie ends with this very serious news footage of like all these dead children in Nicaragua, and it's just very much like makes you feel bad for laughing the whole time. It's like a weird.
Well, it's nowhere near as comedic. But earlier mentioned in Malcolm X, like, that movie is being very direct and showing the Rodney King beating and showing these very modern things.
They're like Nelson Mandela in the movie, and so Walker, I think, is randomly one of the most important historical movies ever, which is funny because of how fantastical
Ed Harris is over his wife's body. Remember that?
He's like, "No, you bitch," or whatever. And no, I mean, it's a hilarious movie. I mean, it really is funny, and it is intended to be funny too. It very clearly, but like, and this is now the property of the people of Nicaragua. Anyway, some of these we mentioned: Dunkirk, The Seventh Seal. There's a movie I think about randomly of making sort of a fantasy movie out of like the Black Death.
That's an amazing movie, one of the best movies ever made. But
Hiroshima Mon Amour, as far as being about like people's reactions to the atomic bombs, and also
that was recent history, but it's still history nonetheless.
And even the main female lead in the movie was like one of those women that had sexual relations with a Nazi, and that they shaved their heads after the war. That was kind of a phenomenon. That literally was in that episode of Band of Brothers I watched last night, where the people in Holland welcomed the Americans into town, and they had this massive parade because the Nazis were like off somewhere else. And in the midst of all this happiness, they literally are taking these women and shaving their heads, and they're like yelling and screaming, and it's just very very like shocking moment. I had known that was a thing, but it's very in your face and like really like intense. I was kind of surprised by that, but that's the whole thing. That movie's really great. Hiroshima Mon Amour. The last in the good category, The Right Stuff.
Yeah, The Right Stuff I really love. Directed by Philip Kaufman, who has written some big movies, and he was one of the writers on, say, Raiders of the Lost Ark. He also, did he write and direct Invasion of the Body Snatchers of the 70s, which is one of the best remakes ever. I think we mentioned that back on our remake pod a long time ago. I really love The Right Stuff. That is, making a lot of comparisons between the astronauts of the, American astronauts of the space age in the early 60s, and this, like, cowboy culture that certain people like, say, Chuck Yeager represented, of some of the pilots who either did or did not make the transition into being astronauts of that time.
That he had broken the sound barrier, and then there were
he was a test pilot. He tested a lot of jets and planes.
But that it's kind of like Reds in a weird way, kind of a remembrance of the people who slightly came before the big things that happened, and kind of what.
And I mean, a lot of those people, were huge figures pre-Armstrong and like Buzz Aldrin. I mean, some of those, like John Glenn, and some of them were massive and huge in the early '60s as celebrities. That by the end of the '60s,
Chuck Yeager just died this year,
just recently.
So I mean, he lived a long time, but
And one thing I always remember about that movie too is all of those people thought Chuck Yeager was the man. They all thought he was the coolest guy ever. But he was someone who, and again, Sam Shepard, loved Sam Shepard in every single way. His performance in that movie is very memorable. He doesn't say a whole lot, and it's a lot about his face and his presence in the movie. He does have some dialogue, but on the whole, he's a fairly silent figure. Earlier in the movie, I think somebody had asked Dennis Quaid like who he thinks like the bravest or the best of them were, and he answers Chuck Yeager. He thinks he is. And then very later in the movie, like after he's already like Dennis Quaid is like, he's done some space flights or he's done some missions, and wholly other journalists asked him the same question, and all of that scene is intercut with a new test that Yeager is doing of some new jet rocket or whatever. And it basically kind of explodes in the air, and he barely gets out of it. And it's this whole situation of whether or not he's going to live or not. And this whole scene is juxtaposed against this nice little press conference that they're all having.
Yeah.
And you can tell Dennis Quaid's character thinks it's still Yeager. He thinks he's the man, but he knows that they all got to hop themselves up, and so he says, "Well, I think I'm the best or the brightest or whatever." And all that's intercut with like Yeager like barely surviving this like test that is going on at the same time. And I think that's like frankly one of Dennis Quaid's best acting moments ever is kind of that moment. And I've only seen that movie twice, and I liked it the first time, but I really loved it the second time.
Yeah, I've only seen it once.
And we've got the Blu-ray, so we need to watch it again sometime soon because I really love The Right Stuff.
Yeah.
So there's certainly, I feel like, most mainstream movies would fit into that middling category.
Yeah,
I mean, so what were some that immediately jumped to mind for that?
There were two. The first is A Field in England.
Okay, I've not seen this.
The Ben Wheatley movie.
Yeah.
Which is kind of about the English Civil War that I think Oliver Cromwell would have fought in.
Yeah.
And the movie, it's an interesting premise where it's about like this battle happens. And there's kind of some people scattered after that walking around in some fields in England.
Yeah, wow.
And that basically they run across this like botanist and sorcerer or whatever, and he like basically is making them look around for a something that's buried somewhere. Mm-hmm. And the movie kind of turns into this whole like real psychedelic horror movie, but it's very kind of just bland, nothing movie, really. It's just kind of some people walking around, and then they take some mushrooms and they run around that crazy. It's just it's really goofy.
Ben Wheatley's movies have that stigma of style, no substance.
Yeah, and so I don't know. I randomly mentioned it because I think there's a lot of things people try to do now where they're like, let's make like a horror movie, but like a historical movie.
Well, The Witch will fit into that.
Right, and I think that's a little bit of a better version of that. Yeah. Well, not a little, quite a bit, but that's still a movie that is kind of, whatever. But that, I didn't really get that movie, but I really was interested in the premise by the sound of it, but there's some funny characters in the movie, like this one guy who's like more of a battle-hardened sort of more veteran. He's like, F off then, and just like all the time, and like,
all right, governor, F off then, governor.
He's like, and he's like trying to take a crap, and he can't.
Apologies to our British listeners.
Yeah, sorry. He's like got a constipation, and they keep like throwing rocks at him while he's trying to crap, and he's like, F off you, and it's just he's like, ah, and like screaming and going on.
It's like Scream, but in British,
But anyway, I mean, it sounds more interesting than it actually is.
That's what it's always sounded like because. I remember when that was coming out, and I was like, oh, that sounds interesting, and then kind of had forgotten about it, and then you had seen it and said it was kind of so-so.
Yeah, but and then the second one I had was Valkyrie, which is a mini
movie
obsession
that, like, frankly,
of mine.
We talk about them way more than it really, frankly,
because I know nobody remembers it. That's the funniest part about it. Another Bryan Singer film, bringing up him multiple times. Scumbag. But that
so we're gonna bring up Days of Future Past too, because that isn't itself a period.
No,
film.
I mean he's has historical figures in it. I guess.
I mean Nixon.
Oh, he's alive. Yeah. But anyway, Valkyrie. Do we want to put in some clips from that here?
Yeah, sure, we'll do that.
Führer's fine.
That is a lie. Adolf Hitler is dead. Operation Valkyrie is in effect.
Only I can initiate Valkyrie.
I'd like a pistol, please. For personal reasons.
Only I can initiate Valkyrie. I mean,
Wilkinson and that. I love too, and this is a trope that is not only in this movie, but you see in a lot of movies, World War II movies, as a lot of like German officers being played by British people Just but with British accents, but we're just going to act like they're German. And again, there's a long tradition of that. That is not new.
Yeah. It's funny that Kenneth Branagh in that movie, that he's like in, I guess, I'm trying to think. He's like in the beginning and kind of the end of the movie. He's like, at first he's kind of one of the main people who's trying to kill Hitler, and then like later on he kind of fades out and like gets reassigned somewhere else or something, and then he's kind of in the movie as like an advisor to him, sort of, but then he just kind of lets Tom Cruise take over, and he's kind of the main guy. Stauffenberg, his character. I've seen that movie so many times I know some of the names of the people. But then at the end, when everybody is either being executed or killing themselves or later being executed, he like goes out into like a woods and like takes a grenade and puts it under his, like he's gonna kill himself so they won't get to him or whatever. And it's like him holding the grenade under his chin, like looking real, serious, like, and it's like replaying voiceover from earlier in the movie where he's like, they need to know that not all of us were like him, and then it ends and he dies or whatever. But like, it's just one of the most just like eye roll worthy, like this movie thinks it's so profound moments ever. That second clip that we played is from one of my favorite scenes in the movie with Terrence Stamp, another British actor, where he's like, the clip we played was, "May I have a pistol, please, for personal reasons." Like, what other kind of reasons would it be? It's like, no, what if he's like,
for
can I have
professional reasons?
Yeah, and then, right, that's what I would think. Yeah, but like, and then he's like, I'm thinking of happier times, and kills himself in front of all of them. Yeah, like, that was an era of suicide by a lot of people that on both sides of the Pacific and the European theater. I'm just like, all right, hang on, stop. Like, what? It's all gonna be all right. Like, but I don't know. Anyway,
I've always slightly resented that movie because of like, for a variety of reasons. For one, it was like Tom Cruise doing a little bit more of a dramatic kind of movie. I mean, it's still like kind of
it's
a
war
action thriller kind of thing. But it was like at a time where, maybe he was in Lines for Lambs around that time, the Robert Redford movie, which was okay to so-so. But there was a window where he was going to maybe do some more dramas.
Like he did in, like, with Eyes Wide Shut and
back
Magnolia.
In the 90s, or Jerry Maguire,
Vanilla Sky,
extreme movies. But, like, those movies didn't really connect, so I think he just ran off and was like, all right, I'm going to just keep doing Mission Impossible and those kind of things. Secondly, specific to Tom Cruise, like, how can you cast him with an eye patch and the movie not be cooler than it is? I just really resent that, frankly.
And he, he had, like, one of his, I think his right hand was blown off, and then he had only, like, 2 fingers on his
third finger, left hand,
Right, yeah. Do you see a wedding ring on my finger? Like, and I'm doing the right hand,
red right hand.
Red right hand. Bing! Anyway.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, right here. In Valkyrie.
Yeah.
Well, which only Valkyrie. I can initiate. Yeah. There's that part where he's like having to use the Walther PPK, and he's got like, he only has these 2 fingers on him, and he's like shooting with that, and it's like, like you said, the movie should be cooler than it is, and it's kind of just like, whatever. But the funny thing about that movie is I was obsessed with it when it first came out. I was like, oh, this is so good, and like, I rewatched it a couple of years ago, and I was like, yeah, this is pretty dumb, like,
or just whatever, forgettable.
But I still kind of hold a place in my heart for it randomly, that I'm like, oh, well, that's an interesting.
Well, I mean, we all have these movies. I had them certainly, of just like, it hits you at a formative age. And it's like you seeing a, quote, adult movie at a certain age, and you're thinking, oh, this is really deep or profound. I've had a few of them before.
Yeah.
American Gangster was a version of that for me, which I still like fine enough.
Call the ambulance.
Call the ambulance, but he's like, call the ambulance. Where are you? I'm right here.
Meanwhile, Ridley Scott is just like, go F you, go F yourself.
Oh, yeah. To everybody. By the way, like, Ridley Scott right now, he's just on a tear, just like saying all kinds of just throwing bombs left and right.
Yeah, like that guy had talked about The Last Duel with him, and he said something like that. Oh, it looks, I don't remember what he said, but he's like, saying something about the way the movie looked, and he was comparing it to Kingdom of Heaven and something else, saying, oh, it looks better than that or something. And he just immediately is like, okay, F you, go F yourself. Just like, and the guy kind of laughs, and it's just like, what is your problem? I don't know. He's just one of them people that has been allowed way too much of a leash.
Should be said, I mean, he's made a lot of historical or period piece films himself.
And we've listed none of them. So what does that say?
Other than American Gangster.
Other than right here. Yeah.
But
anyway, so Valkyrie, which only I can initiate, as I remember.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty dumb... I mean, that's kind of a shrewd movie to make, because it kind of would be a good... thing for what we're going to talk about here in a little bit of like, oh, well, nobody's ever made that story. Like, let's do that. But they've done it now, and it's like, oh, okay, well, yeah. And it also has that guy who's like, I'm listening intently from the Pirates movies. The Pirates movies. He's in like he's the guy that like moves the bomb so it won't kill Hitler, and he I think gets
he's also
more
in that meme where he's like holding sometimes his eyes open.
He's also I wonder if he might be like friends of Tom Cruise's or something, because he's also in Mission Impossible 5 Rogue Nation. He was the Prime Minister of England in that randomly. But he's in that like, and he's very like always watchful, like and mode. But
I don't know if it was the first time they worked together, but Valkyrie, it may have been. I'm not sure. Christopher McQuarrie wrote that movie.
Oh, he wrote that.
And,
okay.
He has since become kind of under him and Tom Cruise have done a lot of work together. He's either having written some movies or now he's directed a lot of the most recent Mission Impossible.
By the way, do you think Tom Cruise looks like a German man at all?
Not really. No.
Yeah. I was just sitting here kind of thinking about it. Because a lot of the other people in the movie, I'm like, yeah, I could buy that. Like Bill Nye looks enough like him, I guess, or. Even Brana, Wilkinson, sure, but like Tom Cruise, I don't know. Tom Mapother, like Thomas Mapother the Fourth, or whatever he is. Anyway, Valkyrie. I wanted to mention it because that's usually the movie I think of when I think of this stuff.
It's just
like,
kind of very middle of the road.
I love it,
like,
but it's like no. I love it, but it's not that good.
Yeah.
But anyway, all right, let's jump to the bad. You might think of more of these than me. I only thought of 3. Pearl Harbor, the first one. Now, we also kind of love that.
Well, yeah, again, let me just say, Pearl Harbor is a bad film on a variety of levels. I mean, the thing that always has struck me about Pearl Harbor is you can quite literally see the Hollywood thinking in real time with this.
Right.
Literally, Jerry Bruckheimer, you see him just sitting at like a Westwood cafe after the Oscar party for some random year in the late 90s, and he's like, what if we took Titanic and Saving Private Ryan and jam them into one movie?
Yeah.
That's exactly what Pearl Harbor is. It tries to, be this big grand love story, which I'm not opposed to. It tries to be a big grand war film, which I'm not opposed to. But the specificity of that project is a little ham-fisted, to say the very least. Very famously, when the bombing's happening, at one point, Josh Hartnett's character says, I think World War II just started.
Which they then changed to World War II just hit us.
Yeah.
Because it was so bad. It's like... And that's just, that just shows how stupid most Americans are, that they believe that World War II didn't happen before us. Like, no, it had been going on for like
2 years.
3 years.
No, well, 2 years.
Or 2.
Yeah.
Right.
Late
See,
39.
I don't even know. I'm right here, and I don't know. So, 2
from
years.
September
I'm
39.
Sorry. I got my years wrong.
December
39 and 41.
Well, one of the most interesting aspects of that movie is the stuff
I should know that. I'm
early
going to be talking
on
about tomorrow.
where Ben Affleck is like volunteering with the RAF to fight against the Germans in the skies. And I think like that whole thread is really cool. And it's like, I'd love to see a movie about American pilots getting involved in that.
Like Flyboys, but better,
And I don't even mean to bash Josh Hartnett, but like he's just not that great of a star. Now, I think he's pretty good in a supporting role like he had in like say the Virgin Suicides, like in that sort of a role. Mm-hmm. But to be like one of the marquee banner above the title actors, he just doesn't have that star
thing
quality.
With Black Hawk Down too.
Yeah. Say what you will about Affleck, and I've said a lot about him. He does command the screen.
He is a presence.
And Kate Beckinsale, she's pretty good too.
That moment. Well, we can just spend we spend 3 hours laughing about the movie, and that's how long it is. But there's that moment where she's in the hospital with that guy who's also in Saving Private Ryan, don't forget.
Oh, right.
And he's like, I'm going to die. And screams.
I'm going to die right here.
But which you're thinking, why are you laughing about that? And it's like, see the movie and you'll know.
But the way it's all shot is just,
and it's like right up on his mouth.
Right here.
later in the movie, he like helps to like, I want to hear the radio contacts, and he's like, okay, like, and it's like a big deal about like, why would she not just be able to hear that anyway?
The opera, Doolittle's raid, that was like a very top secret thing about like when they were going to bomb Tokyo, the first kind of big thing, counterattack. But I don't know. But she called in that favor because she helped save his life or whatever. And so he's like, that's the guy that you remember. He's in Seven. He's one of the guys.
And he's in Seven. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
He's like, he had something attached to his
I remember that.
You remember that? Yeah. But like the thing is, like, I think
that's what I was thinking, and you didn't even need to say it. But I was like, that's the one thing. You know what's funny about that, guys? Whenever I think of him in that movie, I think of the Polaroid photograph that is shown along with that, and I was like, I've only seen that movie once, so it's been memorable.
But what do you think of the battle scenes in Pearl Harbor? Because that's one of the few things people say are quote objectively good for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, they're whatever. I mean, it's stupid.
That was at a point where there was more CGI being done, but it wasn't overly CGI'd yet.
I mean, I got you, zombie!
Cuba Gooding.
Yeah. There's that whole moment where there's like that white officer that's dying, and he's like got him, and they were like friends or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like that moment at the end of towards the end of Independence Day Resurgence, where there's that guy. You remember? So there was a guy in the first Independence Day who like got slammed up against the glass, and the alien was using him to talk or whatever. And he's like in the second movie. He's the guy that played Data on in Star Trek. I don't remember that guy's name, but
Brett Spiner.
Brett Spiner. Yeah. So he's like, then there's that like guy that he's like friends with in the second movie who they like. And we're just like, why should we care who this guy is? And then he dies, and they have a little moment for him. It's just like, well, I don't know who this guy is. Like, but I mean,
well, also, you got to compare it. It's one of those things. Like, it's certainly way more famous, I feel like, for this generation than this movie. But From Here to Eternity for a long time was the Pearl Harbor movie.
Tora also.
Yeah, what do you think of From Here to Eternity as its own work of history? Because I really love that movie.
That's a really good movie, first of all. As a work of history, I think it's pretty good. I mean, it kind of...
Was that made in...
late 40s, wasn't it?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. Let me look it up.
48? Golden Gate in 48?
53.
Oh.
So,
okay,
like,
5 years off.
A little over 10 years after Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, so, that's a good movie. One thing about that movie, I don't mean this in necessarily a bad way, but it feels like it's always 3 seconds away from being a musical. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like, which, whatever.
You're expecting it just to be like South Pacific.
Right, sort of,
Or on the town or something.
Yeah, but no, I think the
Sinatra, a really good performance.
No, I mean, everybody in that movie's great.
Burt Lancaster,
but I think that's good. And then Tora is a fine enough movie. I mean, that's been a long time ago since I saw it. I know it actually has a bad reputation randomly, but I'm like, well, it ain't any worse than Pearl Harbor. I mean, but yeah, with Pearl Harbor, I mean, I guess that they're, I don't know. I'll be honest about the actual, I guess, battle in quotes of Pearl Harbor. I don't know a whole lot about. But what I've always understood is there wasn't a whole lot coming from the American side. It was mostly they were being bombed, and that was it. That movie wants to position it too much of they're riding around in a car and they've got machine guns shooting.
Also, you got Tom Sizemore,
right?
Who know that's in the shadow of being in Saving Private Ryan, which we should say he gets to deliver the titular line, Saving Private Ryan. Like you just can imagine him leaving the trailer that day, like. Yeah, I'm going to say that one.
But I love that.
But his taking the shotgun out at the airfield and shooting up in the air. Me and a colleague just the other day were talking about that and laughing.
Oh, really?
Mr. Miller and me were.
But those scenes in the movie really annoy me because I'm like, I don't think people really did this, but I don't know. And then there's like the cinema verite shots of the planes and the guys filming it, and it's just come on. But yeah, by the way,
also Michael Shannon. Michael Shannon in that.
Yeah. And
I've got a girlfriend.
And then there's that guy who,
the chips are here.
And then there's that part. That's what I was gonna say. Yeah, and he dies.
I mean, Alec Baldwin. Yeah, sort of forced performance from him.
But that's just me.
Yeah.
Speaking about Baldwin, no, we won't go into all that. Did you hear some of the stuff he was saying this week about, I didn't fire the gun? It's like, how did it go off?
Yeah.
I mean, but anyway, whatever. I want to jump real quickly back to Saving Private Ryan before we move on to our next bad movie.
Yeah.
So Pearl Harbor in league with
Yeah.
Saving Private Ryan. There's that moment where he's like, maybe I should go right, sir. He's like, no, I need you to do this. And he's like, maybe I should go left, sir. Tom Hanks looks at him and he's like, maybe you should shut up. It's one of the funniest random moments in a movie. It's like, because the whole movie, Tom Hanks is a pretty nice, level-headed guy.
He's just so sick of it.
You should shut up. The Patriot.
Oh God, I didn't even think about this. Well, let me just say one thing that genuinely really makes me mad is we do not have not hardly any good to great Revolutionary War movies. That's a problem.
We've got, like you say, I haven't seen it, but Drums Along the
That's
Mohawk.
good, and that's actually the historical accuracy.
We actually randomly have more TV shows of it because you've got John Adams, which is that's about John Adams, but it's at least a Revolutionary War.
Revolution.
But then Turn, Washington Spies, don't forget, which I've heard's good.
Yeah,
so
our mom liked.
I like to. We're going to check that out at some point. But yeah, there aren't very many.
And that is just that's not good. We need to have more.
1776, but that movie,
that's a musical. I've not seen that.
I can talk about that real briefly here in a minute. Well, let's talk about The Patriot first.
So The Patriot is one of the few kind of notable Revolutionary War movies, and I don't even remember what his name in the movie is, but Mel Gibson's character is like a composite of like three, basically
militiamen, I guess.
Southern militiamen in the South. Obviously, I said Southern, so why am I harping on the fact that I said it again? Here I am again harping on this. But that
we're from the South, by the way.
Yeah, in case you couldn't tell. But it's just like, I don't even know where to begin with it. It's just so bland, for one thing.
Yeah.
It's Roland Emmerich who directed it.
An American nation.
Oh, that moment, where that guy, it's like...
And he's like got the horn because he can't hear or whatever.
It's like a hearing aid. Right. And like Chris Cooper is like a member of the Continental Army who comes down and is trying to recruit some of the Southerners. And it should be said the Southerners were, especially early on, a little bit more prone to being loyalist, and so there's some that were like, we don't.
We're like, I want to be right here.
Like, I mean, they relied on the British to import a lot of goods, especially in South Carolina, like out of Charlestown, as they say in the movie. That was what it was called back then. But so it's like a lot about him, and he has this deep, dark history. Mel Gibson's. It was during the French and Indian War, all this brutal murder and like. Native American killing that he did. And again, I think it was like, let's just do like a version of Braveheart, but with like the Revolutionary War, which was like Mel Gibson.
We haven't seen that, so.
No, but like that, it was in the wake of that phenomenon, you know what I mean? And Gladiator was around that time. Gladiator is actually a decent enough to good movie.
Gladiator.
Ralphie loves it.
Yeah, Gladiator.
Sopranos. Because I'm currently watching season 3.
I'm glad he ate it. Like, what?
Oh! Just like, but every scene.
Sorry for the younger listeners. And anybody, frankly. But
just Google that. Google images. You'll find all you need to know.
Wow.
On that. But just, but like, I'm currently watching season 3 of Sopranos, and like every other scene he's in it, he's like quoting it, and everybody's looking at him like, shut up already about it. But thoughts on the Gladiator? Or thoughts on,
I actually haven't seen Gladiator randomly, which is a pretty big movie.
Really, Scott, your boy.
Yeah, then I'm like, go F you, go F yourself. I mean, and I'm not really rushing to see that either. I will. I mean, I kind of actually would like to watch it, believe it or not, just for what it is. But
Russell Crowe as a star is kind of hit or miss.
Russell Crowe, as James Elroy once said. The Patriot. It's god-awful. It's probably one of the worst movies that people generally like that I'm aware of.
Yeah. As a young...
even more so than the last movie we're going to talk about.
Young Heath Ledger.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the things I remember it most about is him and Tom Wilkinson as Cornwallis.
Yeah.
And then, of course... plays
Lucius Malfoy.
Yeah,
he's a really good actor.
He's going to be on that new...
Tom Felton's Draco Malfoy.
He's going to be on that new Doctor show.
I'm going to look it up here. I'm gonna look
on CBS. Can't remember the name of it. Anyway, he's like the villain in it. He's like a British soldier.
Jason Isaacs.
Jason Isaacs. Who, of course, was also, we must never forget, one of my favorite roles in any movie is that real redneck officer in Black Hawk Down, who says, when I get through with you, you won't know the difference between S and French fries. When he's talking about, I'm going to make you lick the latrines or whatever. Yeah, that movie's terrible.
Let me just read real quick here. This is what the Wikipedia page says. Most of the film's events occur in the Southern Theater of the war. Despite receiving generally positive reviews from critics, it was harshly criticized by British critics and historians and stirred controversy in the United Kingdom due to its themes of anti-British sentiment, its fictionalized portrayal of British figures and atrocities, including killing wounded soldiers and prisoners of war, the film's main villain shooting a child in cold blood,
yeah.
and
I
a
remember
historical
that,
scene
yeah.
in which a church filled with colonists is locked and burned, which was controversial due to its being similar to the Oradour sur Glane massacre, a World War II war crime perpetrated by the Waffen SS in June 1944. In his review of the film, critic Roger Ebert wrote, "None of it has much to do with the historical reality of the Revolutionary War."
No, I mean, it's really ahistorical, and I don't remember, it's funny, I know that, but I don't remember why exactly, because the movie is pretty forgettable, actually. But yeah, I mean, it's just so all over the place, and it's like, he's running around shooting people real crazy, and it's just like,
no, I guess it's just a Mel Gibson shoot 'em up
him
fest
just going like, and you know, no, I mean, the movie's terrible. I thought about bringing this movie up in the good category, and I'll go ahead and bring it up now. Last of the Mohicans.
That's a great.
Which is a 7 Years War movie, or
French and Indian
the French
War,
and Indian War, but it is also called 7 Years War. But just like the French,
you know,
and
back
Indian
when
War.
Michael Mann like movies look good, you
right?
know?
Yeah,
it's a throwback, you know.
Back when he also made really good movies too.
Yeah.
But yeah, Public Enemies. Oh Lord, can't talk about that yet. Which that's not exactly a historical movie either. I wouldn't necessarily classify it as. But
read the book.
Yeah, I read some of that and it's pretty good. But yeah, Last of the Mohicans is really great. I just wanted to bring that up because that kind of has everything.
That's frankly the closest we
I mean,
have.
It basically has everything that people like about The Patriot, but good. You know what I mean?
It's like, I don't know, replacing Mel Gibson with Daniel Day-Lewis.
And most people really love that movie, so I'm not saying
the people who
that,
know of it love it, yeah.
No, and I know that when I watched it the first time, I was I don't know why, I must have been smoking dope or peyote or something, I don't know, that day that I just was like, didn't get it or something, I don't know, I was like, I don't know. But yeah, we rewatched it about a year ago last summer, and I was like, this is just amazing.
I've shown that in class,
I mean,
and that is really good too to like start to really illustrate to the kids like how the American colonists in the movie are getting fed up with the British, and they're more and more starting to say, hey, we're going to fight this war ourselves. We don't feel like we necessarily need to do whatever they want. So there are like seeds of the American Revolution there, which was true of the French and Indian War anyway, so that is reflective in that movie. So that's frankly the closest we have to like a good Revolutionary War movie.
It was also filmed, pretty much all of it was filmed just
Western North Carolina
near here at Lake James and at Chimney Rock.
But yeah, great movie, love that.
Yeah. Which is funny because that movie's in upstate New York. It's supposed to be, and then we watch it and we're like, "Oh yeah, it's the Blue Ridge Mountains." Yeah, it's just like it doesn't matter.
So many other movies, we just take the reality they tell us, but it gives you an idea of people who live elsewhere when they see this is depicted, and they're like, "No, that's not what it is." And it's like, that was a version of that.
No, but there's some moments early in the movie where it's the big music and it's like shots of the mountains literally look like they're so blue. It's like mountains don't look like that anywhere else, you know, and it's just like very clearly that. But but I wanted to mention that because I forgot to mention that earlier that I thought that's
we love that one.
Yeah. But The Patriot, it's just such a forgettable nothing movie. I mean, to even explain why I don't like it, I think it's just very clear.
I haven't even seen it in a long time.
Yeah, I haven't either.
So
I kind of like to rewatch
some things about it.
I remember there's a random whole part in the movie where like Cornwallis's dogs are named like Jupiter, Mars, or whatever, and which are named after the gods of like the Roman gods of Greek whatever. Yeah. But I was just like, why did he name them after planets? Like, but which I mean,
I do remember too. There was some stuff about the like the colonial militias. There was like frankly like a stock black character that they threw in there, and it was like he sees this as his opportunity to gain his freedom. Yeah. When like actually the British were actually making more of these promises to a lot of black Americans to say, hey, you know what, like we'll give you your freedom after you win the war. And it seemed as though they were going to be more willing to grant that than the
they abolished
American
slavery before America did.
Yeah.
So,
but anyway, so
yeah.
and I'm not saying that there were certain slaves who were freed.
Yeah.
Enslaved peoples who were freed after the war. But that is something that plays a little hard and fast with the reality of that, I remember.
And,
and,
yeah. Whatever. All right, last one. Forrest Gump.
Granddaddy of them all.
Yep. Forrest Gump.
You know, I would maybe categorize this more in the middle category.
Yeah,
but you talk about first
well,
live.
I actually don't think it's a bad movie. Exactly. It's really close, though.
Mm-hmm.
But why I put it in the bad category is because what it and you can speak more on this because you like the Titanic thing. You wrote this really great piece about Titanic and Forrest Gump and how one does it right and one does it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Forrest Gump's the one that does it wrong.
Yeah.
What Forrest Gump posits historically is that things just happen to you and you just walk through life stupidly and you're like a divine being.
Yeah.
And that the stupid and the uneducated always win the day, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think it's quite condescending to the rural American, actually, because it assumes not only... Because clearly Forrest Gump's a nice character. I'm not... And Tom Hanks is great in the movie. I mean, he should.
I think really,
but
one of the worst things about the movie is how good Tom Hanks is, because it then sells the movie more than it should be. You know what I mean? Because I think his performance is not the least bit condescending.
No,
I think it's very compassionate.
Yeah,
but that actually works against what the movie's actually saying in some ways, and it just creates a very strange mixture of ideas.
That character clearly is mentally
deficient.
Mm-hmm. And but even people who are just, just average everyday people, not the smartest people, they just get by, they work and do their blue collar jobs, and I mean, I know a lot of these people, and they're great people, so I'm, but it's like even saying, oh no, but even more than that, this guy really is like not all the way there, and it further degrades that type of person. I feel like to a point that doesn't serve anybody.
Yeah.
But in the opposite of, in the opposite, you wrote all this really well, so you can explain it more. But I think you had basically said that the opposite case of Titanic, where with Titanic it's that people have a place in history and they make decisions that affect history. Whereas in this, it's in Forrest Gump, it's just like things just happen to you and you walk through life stupidly, and but if you're a righteous person, everything good will happen to you or whatever, and you're just a lucky star or whatever.
Yeah.
But I'll let you talk more.
Well,
about that.
I had written this piece. You can look at it. I might actually put I might be selfish about this. I don't care. Whatever.
Go ahead.
Putting the link of this in the episode description of this, because I think this actually talks about in many ways some of the same ideas we've been covering this whole time, from where we started Titanic to where we are here now. This is
where we are right here.
I think I actually had already read this at some point when we talked about this on the podcast. I'm just going to read it again, though, because this is my kind of just blurb. If I had to say anything about my take on Forrest Gump, this is what it is. I'm going to read from a little bit of this article or essay I'd written. Forrest Gump's use of voiceover alone clarifies the faux sincerity, uniting the narrative's many moving parts, denoting machinery that once put under the microscope reveals itself as fraudulent. Forrest is positioned as a middle-of-the-road, white, red-blooded American male, bearing witness to the raucous events of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, whose mental deficiencies rob him of absorbing the era's true significance, even as it continually illuminates for him just how important the sphere of domesticity is in his own existence. His adventures certainly take him all around the globe, but home is never far from the Alabaman's pure, uncomplicated heart. Hanks's charm, stuttering Southern delivery may itself be non-judgmental, yet its juxtaposition with Zemeckis' images are anything but. In contrast to Forrest's restrained acceptance to the events of the day stand the protesters, social activists, and veterans of conflict who appear deranged in their efforts to create a nation and a world more receptive to their needs. It should be noted that these broad characterizations of American life primarily take issue with the political left, though the racist demagoguery of George Wallace is called out in the film explicitly. But even in this distinction, Forrest Gump simplifies the divisive rhetoric strangling the nation's social climate in the 50s and 60s by inferring the character at the helm of this saga is a well-meaning and supportive force of social justice. However, one does not need to fully immerse themselves in the headlines and context of the recent past to understand that such a helpful ambivalence was more the exception than the rule. The film's positing that Forrest is himself a stand-in for a confused but ultimately righteous nation severely underrates the extent to which vast sections, indeed the majority, of American society actively undermines the prospects of a freer, more democratic society. For all the movie's exclamations and digressions to the extent to which Forrest led a life tests the ability of the audience to suspend their disbelief. The assertion that Gump is as ordinary as you or I reveal an awful lot about how white America purports to be at once unassuming and remarkable, especially in its relation to citizens unlike themselves. And that was just kind of a bit of that. But
all very well said.
Thank you. I think that the reason I would put this in the middling category is because it's actually successful rhetoric.
Yeah.
And
yes.
And in being bad at what it is.
Right.
And being good at expressing some bad ideas, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. Because the fact that, I'm not just saying because any movie's popular, it's automatically good. I'm not going to say that. Yeah. But any movie that connects with people is effective in whatever it is doing. That does not make it necessarily a good film. It does not necessarily make it a productive film, but it does mean that it did communicate and it did say something, and people did say, oh, wow, I respond to that in some ways. And I feel like that movie, among many other things, is a 50s, 60s, 70s, early 80s grab bag, mid-century America for dummies, and just hand them this movie, and it's this specific interpretation of that. Should be said, I don't remember the guy who wrote the original book despises the movie, and he wrote the book apparently as a little more of a satire, and did not like how Zemeckis treated it. He thought it was a little too celebratory, a little too simplistic. And the movie does have a certain wit and an irony about itself, but it is ultimately all in service of, we all need to be like Forrest. We don't need to go run away from home. We don't need to go try out new ideas. Because look who does, Jenny does. And the movie just, frankly, the more interesting movie is if somebody took it and did like the Jenny movie.
Yeah.
And Forrest is this annoying figure who continually involves himself in her life.
I'm sorry I broke up your Black Panther party.
And it should be said that Jenny is in a lot of circumstances where she is physically, verbally, in some cases sexually abused. Mm-hmm. And Forrest is not that. Forrest represents this alternative to that he's trying to, quote, rescue her from those things. But as good as that sounds, it's frankly far more condescending towards Jenny than it needs to be. Mm-hmm. Robin Wright's performance in the movie is actually, I think, quite good, and another thing that kind of subtly sells the movie into being something that people respond to. But again, I mean, and it just, there is a certain absurdity it just reaches with, he does this and then he does that. And this one person threads the needle between all this. And the joke of most of it is he doesn't even really he's so, quote, deficient that he doesn't realize that he's at the center of the mid-century of America. And he's a tourist who's just bumbling around all this stuff. Right, yeah. And as someone who's a student of that time period, the more and more I just watch it, the more not only simplistic the movie gets, but just conversationally, when you talk to people, this has become now, for a lot of people, instead of a secondary source, a primary source for a lot of people, especially who come after this, and I'm certainly one who myself did, but a primary source for a great many people of their understandings of this time period. And in many ways, if nothing else, it's a big, huge analogy for Ronald Reagan, who, was a guy who himself, culturally, as mostly of governor of California, then eventually as president of the United States, weathered those cultural storms, and by the early 80s represented this alternative that we're going to turn the page away from all that nonsense of the last few decades, and we're going to get back to, quote, more simplistic, the America that you deserve. It's morning again in America. That whole idea, because it's no mistake that the story ends in the late 80s. I mean, it's very, or early 80s, excuse me. It's very clear what it's trying to do. And so, and I'm not somebody. I'm not
stock in a produce company.
Yeah.
Like, please, it's so dumb. And, the movie just and also, can I just interject, because all this is amazing? I'm just going to give the real lame brain. The movie just pisses me off. Like, it just makes me angry, like, to watch, because not only because, like you said, I recognize that people see this as gospel.
Yeah,
there is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then there's Forrest Gump.
The Gospel of Forrest, yeah.
Right. Now, we have the Gospel of... Our fifth Gospel, as we said, is John Hurt and Jackie.
Yeah.
You know, something that's actually religious.
Yeah.
But, no, I mean, the movie puts him... He's like a Jesus figure.
Yeah.
Almost. Like, he's a saintly figure.
He is a savior who walks into all of these things. He walks into Lieutenant Dan's life. He walks into Jenny's life. He walks into all these people's lives, and they're all just like, man, and I just need to be more like
Lieutenant
Forrest.
Dan, Jesus this, and Jesus that. You hear what I said?
I mean, Sinise in that movie.
Yeah, he's actually pretty good.
You know?
No, I mean, that's the thing, is that the movie has all these parts to it that I'm like, okay. Like, I kind of get that.
I actually
but,
find it to be a fascinating political document.
Yeah.
And it actually is. I think people need to take it, because there's a lot of people who hate it.
Yeah.
And for the right reasons, I would say. Yeah. But I think they need to take it a little more seriously than they do, because, and they probably deep down understand that, but this is how we understand a lot of awful things that are going on in America right now and have been going for a while, are a lot of things that people take from not just this movie, but understandings that go back to even before Reagan, but specifically the Reagan era, that are still a stain on this country and that are still holding this country back from what it needs to be. Yeah, sorry to get political that directly, but whatever. If you've made it this far, you probably don't care. So, again, people who don't like it, that's fine. But you need to at least understand what it's saying and the power and the hold that it has over the culture, because we're nearly 30 years removed from it. And you know what's strange is, like, I know when it came out, it was a big box office hit, won a lot of Oscars. It was that versus Pulp Fiction in '94 for like a Best Picture. That was the two movies. Of course, Pulp Fiction is the better film, and by leaps and bounds. But that in itself is a homage, a grab bag of influences. I mean, I feel like in some ways both of those are very 90s products, in the sense of we're coming to the end of the millennium, we're coming to the end of the century, and let's
got one for every decade.
So they're both in their own way grab bags of you want this, you want that. Now, I think Pulp Fiction is positioned towards a slightly younger audience. I'm not someone who really complains about the, quote, boomers as much as other people, but, like, Forrest Gump is the boomer text of all boomer texts. I mean, it's like that and the song American Pie, which I actually love that song in its own way.
I've been listening to that song a lot the last week, and it's honestly getting better. Because that's a song that used to annoy me, but the more I think about it, I think it's it's weird. This sounds kind of bad to say, like I'm being insulting to the song. It's the most profound, basic thing ever.
Yeah,
no, I mean, it truly is a profound song. When you I've just really been listening to it and thinking about all the things that it likely means, and it is a truly amazing work of music. I mean, and it's one of the best things that has ever been made, probably.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like them good old boys were drinking whiskey and rye.
Singing, "This will be the day that I die."
Took that Chevy to that levee. Took that Chevy to that Eugene Levy's house. But yeah. I mean, so yeah, you're right. But that's gospel to people.
Yeah. And it's not just them who ate it up. It's their kids. It's their grandkids. And so, and I say this as someone who has a lot of boomer sensibilities. Like, most of my favorite art, literature, film, music is anywhere between from 1950 to 1980. That's I've got things before and after that I love, but I myself am really love and obsessed with that time period, as you know already by this podcast. So I fit into someone I feel like who could be a, quote, mark for this. But I don't know.
But the more you learn about that kind of stuff, the more ridiculous it is.
And I feel like any serious, aware, self-conscious person of the boomer generation would also understand and recognize these things as well.
Yeah.
But again, I don't even know if I'd say I don't like the movie. I'm just I'm actually fascinated by the movie as a political text so much that I'll never, quote, hate it, even though I hate what it is saying, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And I'm just more fascinated than anything else. But again, as a work of history, it's bad. But as a political text, it's very important. But it's very
something
important
interesting
movie.
I just now thought of. I haven't seen Philadelphia, but isn't it in the movie that Jenny dies of AIDS? Right,
Yeah.
that's more or less what it is. And then I guess the next year.
Philadelphia might have been before that.
Or when was Philadelphia? Was it 93?
It was before that, I
think. Okay.
Because he won
the
2
year
consecutive.
before that.
Right.
I couldn't remember if that was 93 or 95.
Forrest Gump was the second one.
That he was in that movie.
Yeah.
But a year before that. And it just seems so just like...
Yeah.
Disrespectful in a way, frankly, but whatever.
Zemeckis, generally?
No.
Thoughts? Yeah.
No. Castaway, I think, is
That's your favorite from him?
Oh, definitely. That movie's amazing. I mean, I love Castaway. I think that's just a really great movie in a lot of ways. And I think I've been thinking a lot about it the past year because I rewatched it. I think that's truly a truly great movie. But,
especially for like a mainstream movie that had the budget that it had and had the cultural footprint that it had. Yeah.
Because it's literally... It's the perfect kind of movie. You get Tom Hanks, you put him on an island, let him be Tom Hanks. I mean, that's literally all you got to do.
I mean, there's no other actor you would want to spend that time with than him, I don't think, really.
Hey!
I mean,
as he says,
you know, Zemeckis, I'm like 60 to 50, 55 to 60% on board with, because I truly do love the first Back to the Future. That's another movie that you could talk about in a historical lens. In the 80s, they were obsessed with 50s nostalgia, obviously, and so that plays a role in all that.
Yeah, I'm not really...
I do love that first Back to the Future. I do love Castaway. I quite like Allied, a more recent one that he did. He's a director that gets very tied in down to the technology and the technology to make the movie.
I like Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
That's good, too. It's quite great, actually. But something like Forrest Gump, it made a big deal. Oh, we're going to insert him into X political... event or this thing or whatever. I
think, there's so many awful moments in that movie. I think truly the worst is when he's on Dick Cavett with John Lennon.
Yeah.
I think that is so bad. He's like, basically gives him the song Imagine in real time.
Yeah.
It's
this is the same guy who already also gave Elvis the idea to shake his hips.
Right.
And so he also gave John Lennon the idea for Imagine.
And he also came up with a Have a Nice Day.
Right. And then he also is the guy who called in Watergate. Oh, there's a break-in. Like, how many more things is he going to do?
That's what I'm saying. But more than anything, the Imagine that I think...
I mean, I'm not a huge John Lennon stan.
No. Yeah,
but, we're going to act like some doofus on TV gave him the idea for that. Just, give me a break.
That makes me so mad. The more I think about it, the more I want to slam... a car into something like a brick wall. I don't know. Hurt myself if I have to.
Copy of Forrest Gump.
It makes me so mad I can't even speak almost.
So let's move on. Let's move on. Phew, we're out of it. All right. Yeah. So we thought we'd end this by pitching some historical films we would like to see about certain things that we think are ripe for an interpretation or adaptation. And because we're all the time, we hear about this or that, and we're like, ooh, that would make a good little movie or a good little story. I can go first.
I don't really have anything, I'll be honest with you, because I'd actually forgotten to kind of come up with some stuff.
Well, we can just do mine then.
Yeah, fine. I have one or two just random
It can even be an abstract idea.
Right. I'll let you go ahead first, though, and I'll see if I can think of... I had them a minute ago, a couple that I just barely thought of.
For some time, I've been quite obsessed with the divide between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Both of these guys were actually born the same year. They were both born in 1767. And when I look at them two, and I think I had this idea partially before Hamilton. And by the way, this idea is not a musical, even though I quite like Hamilton. But I was
believe we have to get to the point now where it's like talking about history. This won't be a musical.
Right. I'm just saying it was kind of. Right. I had thought more about it after Hamilton, even though it's. It gave me some more food for thought. Because I was thinking about the divide between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, sir. The divide between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. That in the mid, 1820s, and it seems very, very specific, but this is going to get into some bigger ideas, that they represented kind of the two dueling ideas of what America could be. One guy, John Quincy Adams, the son of a president, aristocrat, had literally traveled around the world as a child with his father, literally at the courts of kings, at the courts of artisans, and just finest education. I mean, literally, you're the son of John Adams.
Yeah.
So you're literally at the the hands of one of the men who helped craft the Declaration of Independence. So he was a brilliant man. John Quincy Adams is also. But an aristocrat, somebody who by the mid-1820s was actually the Federalist Party. It's kind of one of the first major political party in American history, the party of Hamilton, the party of John Adams, was wanting to bring back a more nationalized form of government, and thought that, he certainly was someone who wasn't of aristocratic background, and certainly thought that, he certainly bought into a more Republican ideal of the rich and the powerful should maybe have more of a say. You compare him to somebody like Andrew Jackson, was the first president, first guy who became president, who was born to abject poverty, came from nothing. His 1770s experience was not sitting at the courts of kings. His 1770s experience as a child was literally dodging the British, and kind of across the various places he lived, across North South Carolina,
that
into
famous
Tennessee.
Story about he did his whole Andrew Jackson thing, which was being a total a-hole.
Yeah, that was his.
He was good at doing that.
Yeah.
And he talked back to a British officer, and I think
took
the
a tip of
officer
his sword.
took a sword and slapped him across the face with it, and it hit him with the part of it that wouldn't cut him, but it hit him, and it left a mark on him the rest of his life.
Yep.
So yeah.
So I mean, a guy who his I can't quite remember. I recommend reading American Lion. Really good biography of him. I think his father had died when he was pretty young. He had a brother or two who had died in the Revolution. So I mean, you could not talk about two more different upbringings, literally about the exact same time in history. Eventually was a fairly self-made man, actually became an aristocrat, actually married, aristocratic woman, but was always considered a man of the people, one of the most beloved presidents of his time within his constituency, and someone who actually wanted to make the voting process, frankly, more democratic by virtue of Adams wanting to be a little bit more of a Republican. And I'm not talking about Republican Party now. I'm talking about Republican in
What the Republic
more
means.
classical sense.
Yeah.
And so,
Which that's what the Republican Party
and so
is
both
now,
of these
too,
guys went toe-to-toe in the 1824 election. John Quincy Adams won that one, but did Henry Clay and him strike a corrupt bargain, is what Jackson yelled about for 4 years. Jackson would later win, in large part because a lot of poor white people who had never got to vote before, voting restrictions had been taken out of land ownership. So a lot more white people were now able to vote, white men, should be said, were able to vote. And while that certainly necessarily shouldn't be celebrated on the level of African-American suffrage or women's suffrage, that still was an important movement and a moment to have that open up. Obviously, the Jackson presidency was fraught mostly with the, kind of the secession crisis with South Carolina nullification crisis, and then also his treatment of the Cherokee Native Americans. And so...
got rid of the bank.
Yeah, got rid of the National Bank. So I just am wildly fascinated by the divide between these two guys, and I think while they seem very specifically tied to the 1820s and 1830s, I think they represent the literal divide that we still have in America. Not the divide, because there are more divides than this, but and it should be said, post-presidency, Jackson kind of faded into the background. He was supportive of, say, the Mexican-American War, supportive of the Texas War for Independence. Meanwhile, John Quincy Adams was one of the guys getting louder and louder about this whole thing called abolitionism. And he was like, maybe we should actually support abolitionism in the 1840s. They both died in the 1840s. I might be wrong about this. I think Andrew Jackson died in 1847. Quincy Adams died, I believe, 1849. So they also literally almost lived the
Quincy
same
Adams
lifetimes.
was the first president to have a photograph taken of him. So he would have been about as late as you can get, I think.
Yeah. So I just find them to be two wildly fascinating figures that, like I said, I think represent both good and bad things about America in two men in a pretty deep and philosophical way.
Well, and I think that's an interesting story to come up with because it kind of represents the end of early colonial republicanism, as far as, like you said, that the idea, and he's kind of the last gasp of the founding fathers.
Well, that's another thing too, is that one thing he was criticized for, Quincy Adams, was when he was trying to pass some of his like more Federalist-esque policies, a lot of them like, wait a minute, that sounds like the stuff of your father and the stuff of like the 1790s. We're done with the Federalists, and so you need, and so. And
I guess kind of the end of the era of good feelings then when he started to bring that stuff up because 'cause everybody loved Quincy Adams there for a while, at least at the beginning of his presidency.
And so I just and then another thing that for me philosophically is very important about John Quincy Adams specifically as a figure is that he is the torch between the founding fathers and abolitionism. That he was of a certain yoke of man. Again, he was the son of a man, but he was a part of a certain generation that knew of he knew the founding fathers, of course. His own father was one. And by the end of his own life was already saying we need to transition away from this system openly. And so to him, philosophically, for me, he is a very important figure in terms of that charting of that journey. And also, just specifically, Jackson, him, even Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, some of those guys, they were kind of the first generation of leaders that were not founding fathers.
Yeah.
They were like the first ones of like the next generation, so to speak. And there was a lot of anxiety and even in Andrew Jackson's own life that he was like, this whole experiment called America is under attack by this nullification crisis. He felt a responsibility. I need to keep the country together in the midst of all this. And one of the few things him and Quincy Adams agreed on was that South Carolina needed to stop the nullification crisis. So, I find them to be seemingly a very specific two men, but in actuality, they represent some very deeply fundamental ideas between, hey, America needs to be a government of the people, by the people, for the people, as Lincoln once said. One of Lincoln's heroes growing up was Andrew Jackson. But then also some of the darkest elements of America, too, with racism, nativism, getting rid of Native Americans. Contrast that with the more progressive ideas about America, but also a certain remove from the, quote, real America. And so, anyways, that's the context for all this. My idea for what this would actually be would be two simultaneously shot, almost dueling biopics of each man, one of John Quincy Adams, one of Andrew Jackson, loosely probably told about them both in old age, looking back on the rest of their lives. We haven't said anything really about Andrew Jackson. He was a war hero in the War of 1812. That would certainly play a role in his
in a
kind
battle
of rise
that
of
meant
his,
nothing.
Yeah, but still, that was added to his celebrity significantly.
One of the most annoying songs ever is the Battle of New Orleans, by the way.
Yeah.
Isn't it just called that?
I think so, yeah.
My God. Anyway.
But
that and Boy Named Sue, I'm just like, good Lord.
But I'm just very fascinated by the divide between... They literally had the same lifespan almost. One born of poverty, one born of privilege, and both are the manifestations of their own destinies and ultimately visions of what America is going to be.
That for me, destiny, right? Yeah.
But so again, like 2-3 hour biopics of each man. You would even have some of the same scenes in the movie. In each movie, but shot from slightly different perspectives about kind of from their divides.
Yeah,
and also another thing about Andrew Jackson is, again, his wife died literally in between when he was elected and when he took office. Mary Donaldson, I believe. Or no, it was Elizabeth. He had a woman that was his wife's niece that actually lived with him and actually functionally served as First Lady in the White House.
Yeah,
and there was a lot of drama about all that.
There was a really fascinating... book obviously called Burr that Gore Vidal wrote that was about it was about Aaron Burr, but it talked Andrew Jackson was a character in the book, and it kind of talked about some of that. He was the president at the time, because that whole book Burr is about Aaron Burr, but it's also about a man writing about Aaron Burr, and it was basically the whole
Rachel Donaldson was his wife, by the way.
That whole book is basically all a frame story of a guy trying to research to find out if Martin Van Buren is actually the son, like unknown kind of son of Aaron Burr, because they're wanting to use that in the next election. Andrew Jackson's wanting to use that in the next election to kind of against Martin Van Buren because Aaron Burr was such a dirty name at that point because of all the secessionist stuff or whatever. But that's an interesting, really good book. One thing about that book, though, this is kind of a spoiler of the book, but that it turns out towards the end of the book that you realize that the guy who's the journalist is also the son of Aaron Burr, and it's just like, why? And that's just kind of stupid. It's like, why is that anyway? But that's a really good book.
But just in general too, I just find that to be a very fascinating period in American history. It's kind of under talked about because it's after the Revolution and it's before the Civil War. It's like this very itchy period.
Yeah.
The Missouri Compromise was in the early 1820s, and very famously, John Quincy Adams said about the Missouri Compromise the fact that, okay, Missouri goes in as a slave state, Maine goes in as a free state, but then Missouri was like, we don't even want like free black people to even come to this place. And JQA very famously said something along the lines of, this is the the first chapter of a tragic volume or something like that, basically predicting the Civil War.
Yeah.
And so I just think that relationship, and they were not friends by any means. I don't even think they actually had a whole lot of personal interactions even really, but I think that there's something to be said about those two men and how they are representative of the larger ideological things deeply about America.
Yeah.
And
seems like a more obvious movie to make out of that, which was kind of made, sort of pseudo-made with 1776, would be with Adams and Jefferson. But that's been so talked about that I feel like even making a movie about that would kind of be a waste of time almost. That I feel like, that would be a way more shrewder.
And again, like as far as all these relationships, whether it be like Jefferson and Adams or Burr and Hamilton, this is by far the more distant of the two. Like they didn't actually have all that much, and I think that would actually make it interesting because you would see wholly other worlds of the other two more so, and it actually would make America feel bigger, and its place in the world as well. So that's kind of my loose idea. Is I'd love to see somebody do that at some point. But your idea, or
well, mine are very general.
Well, maybe we'll workshop it. We'll come up with something.
Well. A lot of mine are actually older stuff, of like older history. Well,
Roman.
I know that the first draft of the Maccabees, but seriously, going back to Mel Gibson, I know he wanted to make a Maccabees movie. I think it'd be interesting to make a Maccabean revolt movie because I feel like nobody talks about that. How like literally it was like, and I don't know a whole lot about that. All I know is that there was the Maccabees had like rose up to retake the temple in Jerusalem, and I just think that, and that's where the whole Hanukkah menorah, that whole kind of is what that comes out of. That they they only thought they had enough oil to burn for a day, and they burned it for 8 days or whatever, But that I think that would be an interesting movie. I don't know. There was another one I was thinking of that I can't remember now off the top of my head. Well, I think it'd be interesting to make a movie out of the Nazis in New York, Madison Square Garden. Make a movie out of that.
You had said something about that recently, I remember,
Well, I'm going to be kind of doing that this week a little bit with my kids and be like, hey, did y'all know about this? And, of course, they wouldn't have, I'm sure. But I just think
my great-grandfather went.
Yeah, and it's like, well, don't listen to anything I'm going to say then, I guess. I think that's one of the darkest stains on this country that there's ever been, and there's a lot of dark stains on this country. I mean, but as they said in The Mummy, this is a messed up country. Now, that was about Egypt, but Egypt not as messed up as America, as it turns out. Well, in other ways they are, I guess.
Yeah,
now
they had slavery in their own way back in the day.
Yeah,
for longer too.
Yeah, but I think that would make an interesting movie. There were a couple I did kind of think of, and now I can't remember them off the top of my head. Did you have any other ones?
Those were the biggest ones. I've actually got like legit other ideas that I'm not going to necessarily put out there in the event that they ever do become anything.
Yeah.
So, but that is something hypothetically I'd really love to see.
Yeah, I apologize. I didn't come up with many. I
was bouncing off your ideas for the good, middle, and bad anyway, so that works.
Yeah.
But next week, it's Christmas time after all, isn't it not?
Yeah.
So This is our first Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, by the way. So this is a big deal in its own way, you know?
No, we're not doing Batman and Robin, by the way.
No.
It's not, come on, sing!
Louder, come on, sing!
Come on, I'm right here!
Jingle All the Way from
Wow.
1996.
Jamie, please.
I mean, you know, one of the great...
Movies?
No, not
no,
not necessarily that. I mean, maybe. I don't know.
It's
I mean,
a-
let's
it's
see.
a-
Sight
it's
and
a-
Sound
I
will
mean,
be coming
yeah.
out with their
It's
new...
a gift certificate. A gift certificate.
I mean, again, Sight and Sound ranking
Yeah.
next year. Vertigo went to the top of the list. Who knows what'll
Who knows?
happen?
Here's to you, Dad. I mean, yeah.
Obviously, I think it's one of the definitive, like, oh, time's running out, got to get the Christmas gift.
I mean, that's
movies.
literally
I
the
mean,
only movie I can think of that, but it will be that type of movie forever. You know, because to jump to Krampus for a minute,
which I liked.
yeah, that was an all right movie. Krampus.
Which Michael Daltrey did that, who was the guy behind Trick or Treat, I think.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
Which
that was
we like,
Well,
yeah.
that was a better movie.
Yeah.
But yeah, Krampus. Good
Somehow
enough.
more messed up.
Good enough little movie. Yeah. Good enough little movie, but that movie starts notably with like a Black Friday slugfest, basically. That I feel like still didn't top the madness, obviously, of Jingle All the Way.
No.
Where there's that scene where they're like giving out those balls.
Oh, yeah.
Basically as a drawing for the Turbo Man doll.
Yeah.
And he's got and the new, he's like, and by the way, he's like, by the laws of supply and demand, the list price on all the dolls just doubled. And they're like, oh, screw you, or whatever.
But they're mad, but then they're just gonna
like,
still-
well, we need it, though, yeah. So, no, I mean.
I think that whole thing was inspired by a producer or somebody had a lot of trouble getting a Buzz Lightyear doll.
Mm-hmm.
And that literally the whole project came out of what if we did a movie about that type of a thing.
I wonder why the movie's so soulless then.
Yeah,
You know?
there you go.
Yeah, that movie.
But it's like it's a Christmas classic around this
No, I
house.
mean,
I mean,
we
we
love
quote
it.
it all the time.
Yeah,
it's
it's
dumb, but you know we love it.
Yeah. Phil Hartman in that movie, I think, is one of the most subtly underrated performances in any movie. I'm not even kidding.
He's really good.
He is such a slime ball
Yeah.
in that. He reminds me of certain people that we
That's all I'm
know
gonna say.
that I'm like, oh, yeah, that's definitely... Like, as I started to know that person more in my life, I'm like, that is literally who that person
they
is.
look
Now,
like
this
him,
person
too.
is genuinely, I think, a good person at heart, but they're that...
But they literally physically
but they
look
are
like
like
him, too.
that. Yeah, they are like that.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, yeah, because he's genuinely not a good guy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a fascinating idea to literally take Arnold Schwarzenegger, be like, let's put him in a kid's Christmas movie. Oh, by the way, let's have Sinbad in it too.
Yeah, right.
You know,
well,
like,
that was Sinbad's moment was back in
and
the
Martin
day.
Mull,
Yeah.
because we need that. You know,
Rita Wilson, the mom.
Oh yeah,
Jake Lloyd,
that is who
Anakin
that is.
Skywalker himself.
Yeah. Jamie. Please.
I'll never forget
Yeah.
a while back, Jake Lloyd got a speeding ticket, and I was going to comment, now this is pod racing on the thing,
Yeah.
and it literally
Yeah.
went there, and there's literally like 24 or
Somebody's
more
like,
comments.
whoa!
And-
Like, yeah. But no, I mean, that movie, I guess the reason we're doing it is because we want a little cheer this holiday season.
Yeah,
you
we just
know?
wanna have
A little
fun.
cheer with our beer, you
The
know?
other thing,
Remember the moment in the movie where he gives that, remember there's like a daggum reindeer in the movie?
Oh yeah, and he like gives
And like,
it
he gives
eggnog.
it beer?
Oh
No, I
no,
think
no,
he gives
no,
it
it's
beer, I'm
beer.
pretty
It's
sure.
beer. Yeah.
Yeah, and-
you started it after you picked the wrong day. And
Yeah.
then I hit him. And say-
Anyway, what were you going to say? I'm sorry.
Well, I was just thinking about Jake Lloyd and just go to a Star Wars place for a second. Just like he's literally as a kid hanging out and friends with Greedo. Just like why? And then
Yeah.
how much do we talk about the fact that freaking Darth Vader built C-3PO?
That's the dumbest thing.
It's just
ever.
like why?
Yeah.
Like
So stupid.
Anyways.
Because people act like, you know, we were talking about...
that's
you
not
said
my
about-
history.
Yeah. It's like you're making... you were talking about making America feel bigger with those movies. I think that would be a great idea because you're getting all these different versions of what America really is. That, people say stuff like, oh, that makes it feel bigger. It's like, no, you blanking idiot. It makes it feel smaller. Like,
Because
you know,
everybody just knows each
Because
other.
everybody's right there, and it's like, well, there's nothing going on other than in Tatooine. Everything. It's like, where nothing goes on, everything happens. You know, it's like, so what happens in Coruscant? Oh, nothing. Nothing
One
really.
other thing
you
I'd
know?
actually like to add as far as historical films, going back to the 19th century ever so briefly, Bleeding Kansas as a thing is a very, actually, I could make a really compelling story. Because
You know, I
that in
used
and
to
of
say
itself
they
was
needed to
pretty-
make a John Brown movie, but frankly, now that they made Good
Well,
Lord Bird,
that was so good,
I don't
yeah.
think they need to do anything.
No, Ethan Hawke was extraordinary.
I mean,
as John Brown.
I mean, how about none? Moment.
But
yeah.
Bleeding Kansas do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, literally that summer, 1856, was when the Preston Brooks stoning.
That was that month. That was that
happened.
Summer too.
It was that same time. Literally, that was
literally.
Going on.
It seemed like the world was going to end at that point. I mean, you know, the Civil War was fought in 10,000 places. As Dave McCulloch said. What's funny about those? By the way, to jump to the Civil War, which we're still watching.
Yeah,
very good, but you know,
we're getting there. We need to like write the like letters home, but like we're watching the Civil War.
Yeah.
Just like
it's like it's like being on Taboo Island. It's like that. One of our old podcasts was to The Watch. They used to talk about only one of them was watching Taboo, and he's like Taboo Island that had those little like quill scratching sounds on it. But anyway, on that show, you know, it's funny where they'll start it, and it's like. In 1860, whatever year it was, it's like
all these other things.
Yeah, and it's like this happened here, and it's like Karl Marx had written his Das Kapital, and like my favorite one is Dostoevsky had written Notes from the Underground. It's just like, why do I need to know about that? You know, it's like
it's just obviously a way to say what else is going on in the world while this is happening.
It's just like okay, but yeah, like
Das Kapital,
and Notes from the Underground, like.
Velvet Underground. Jonathan Richman.
Threw it underground.
Jonathan Richman as John Brown.
Anyway, what are we talking about? Oh, Wing, Kansas, yeah. That happened one time.
In the milk?
Getting the wilt in the milk.
But Jingle All the Way, yeah.
Yeah,
so we're doing that, right?
We're coming at the end of a 3.5 hour podcast. It was like, who even knows anymore?
Which we didn't even do a movie during this whole time either. Just gabbing.
We were waiting to wilt. We were just waiting to wilt in the milk the whole time.
We haven't seen Jingle All the Way 2.
I haven't seen Yo Gabba Gabba.
Jingle All the Way 2 with Larry the Cable Guy.
Oh, I forgot about that.
Yeah.
God.
When they're like no, maybe I'm thinking of, is there a pacifier? That was The Rock, right?
Oh, God. No, that was that the Tooth Fairy sequel?
No, maybe that's what I'm thinking of. The Rock was in some movie that I think they recast in the sequel. I Larry the Cable Guy.
Yeah, I think it was the Tooth Fairy, wasn't it?
Might have been, yeah, I think
because it's like, ooh, look at this fat redneck man in a Tooth Fairy costume. It's just really nasty. Like,
I mean, Larry the Cable Guy is a very mid-2000s
like female body inspector era. You know?
Oh my God, like hanging by Steel Creek,
witless protection. I mean, like Jeff Foxworthy is on your speed dial kind of life. You know, sitting and eating at Golden Corral and seeing that Jeff Foxworthy is like on the little like, you know, the stuff they have at the daggum table where it's like, oh, this like promotion, and it's got like Jeff Foxworthy's face, and you're just like,
this has not been changed in 15 years,
right? Yeah.
And like, you know, mid-2000s real
fifth grader?
No, like Dale Jr. could win it all this year, you know, like that whole moment in time, you know, like, ooh, Sirianni, like now playing, you know,
and we'll put a boot in your ass. Like, I mean, that was our life there for a while.
Yeah.
Also, don't forget that song all summer long. Like, we were smoking funny things. Like Kid Rock song.
Oh my God, we were at Steel Creek, and this one Fruit Loop woman was like driving around in a golf cart all day on repeat. That song was
on
playing.
Repeat. Yeah, on repeat. Yeah, no,
Kid Rock on repeat. Kid Rock on repeat.
That was when that song had just come out. I remember I hadn't heard that song in like 15 years until a couple months ago.
Yeah.
I heard it so many times I was like, all right. It's like, that song's so annoying because first of all, it's Kid Rock. Second, it's like taking Werewolves of London and Sweet Home Alabama and putting them together. Neither of which I'm particularly a fan of. I like Werewolves of London more than Sweet Home Alabama, but yeah, that whole era was just like, wow. Another thing about Steel Creek, there was a guy that used to work there. He was always running around on a golf cart. He was like, I don't know what he did exactly.
He was just, I don't know.
He was just like watched and makes it. They called him Barney Five because he like drove around.
We always called him the bicycle police too.
Because he always made sure that kids weren't doing anything bad. I guess his unofficial duties were to like drive around and be Barney Five. Yeah, basically. Right. But that's what they called him because
he's probably not even alive now, and I'm not even trying to demean him. Like, you know,
yeah, well, a lot of those people that own that, I don't even know if they're alive anymore.
There's a dear friend of ours who passed away relatively
we
recently.
didn't even know about until recently, and he was what we called the mayor of Still Creek. He was there forever. So Still Creek.
We'll leave that
R.I.P.
podcast for another day.
Yeah. Anyway,
you already got a taste
I
of it.
guess so. History happened.
So let's see.
And
so, like, there was a movie called Nightmare for Christmas. We're not sure what was going on there.
Yeah.
My Winnipeg, great. So, like, history and movies, something like
it doesn't. I'm not. Did I get my check in the mail? I don't know.
We'll have to wait and find out.
Yeah.
So
but,
next week, Jingle All the Way.
Jingle All the Way will be right here.
This is Kyle.
This is Levi.
Take care. God bless.